Chapter 9, Part 2 of The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Communist Attacks on the Free World During the Postwar Period. Part 2. The Communist Attack on South Korea. It will be recalled that the Yalta Agreement allowed Russia to take over North Korea at the same time the Soviets occupied Manchuria. As elsewhere, the Russians did not withdraw their troops until a strong communist puppet government was firmly entrenched. As for South Korea, U.S. forces occupied the territory up to the 38th parallel. During 1949, a United Nations mandate required both Russia and the U.S. to withdraw their troops. The Russians left behind them a powerful North Korean Red Army consisting of 187,000 well-trained and well-equipped troops, 173 Russian tanks, quantities of Russian-built artillery, and 200 Russian planes. On the other hand, South Korea was a newborn republic with an army of 96,000 men who were poorly equipped with practically no tanks, anti-tank weapons, heavy artillery, or fighter planes. This meant that by the end of 1949, South Korea was even more vulnerable to attack from North Korea than Formosa was from Communist China. And the Washington diplomats had assured both Formosa and Korea that in case of attack, they definitely could not expect any military help from the United States. As spokesman for the diplomatic left-wing contingent, Owen Lattimore explained the situation. The thing we do is let South Korea fall, but not to let it look as if we pushed it. In the early dawn of Sunday, June 25, 1950, 8 divisions of the North Korean Red Army spilled across the 38th parallel and plunged southward towards the city of Seoul. Frantic calls went out from President Syngman Rhee to the Security Council of the United Nations, to President Truman in Washington, and to General Douglas MacArthur in Japan. All 3 responded. The Security Council pronounced North Korea guilty of a breach of the peace and ordered her troops back to the 38th parallel. If Russia had been represented, she no doubt would have vetoed this action, but the Soviet delegates were boycotting the Security Council because China continued to be represented by the nationalists rather than by the Chinese communists. General MacArthur responded by flying to Korea and reporting the desperate situation to Washington. President Truman responded by completely reversing the policy of his diplomatic advisors and ordering General MacArthur to pour U.S. ground troops in from Japan to stop the red tide. Thus the war began. For several weeks, the situation looked very black. General MacArthur was made supreme commander of all United Nations forces, but at first these were so limited that the shallow beachhead at Pusan was about all they could hold. Then General MacArthur formulated a desperate plan. It was so difficult and illogical that he felt certain it would come to the communists as a complete surprise. It did. On September 15th, halfway up the Korean peninsula, the U.S. Navy, with 2 British carriers, the Air Force, Army, and Marine Corps combined to launch an ingenious invasion at Incheon, a point where the 29-foot tide made a landing seem fantastic. Split-second timing permitted landings, and the next thing the North Koreans knew, they were trapped in the jaws of a mighty military pincer movement which cut across their supply lines and then rapidly closed in to wipe out the flower of the whole North Korean army, which, of course, was concentrated in the south. It was a magnificent victory. MacArthur then turned his armies towards the north. The ROKs, South Koreans, went up the east coast while the other UN troops went up the west coast. In doing this, General MacArthur was required to act on obscure hints rather than specific directions from Washington and the UN. For a while, it appeared that he might be forbidden to pursue the enemy forces retreating to the north. By the middle of October, the coastal spearheads of the UN offensive were nearing the northernmost parts of Korea, and the war appeared practically over. There was the immediate prospect of unifying the entire Korean peninsula and setting up a democratic republic. Then, in November, unexpectedly disaster struck. From across the northern Korean boundary of the Yalu River came the first flood tide of what turned out to be a Chinese Communist army of 1 million men. As these troops came pouring into North Korea, the UN forces found themselves smothered by a great wave of fanatical, screaming, suicidal humanity. MacArthur radioed to Washington, "We face an entirely new war." The UN lines were cut to ribbons as their wall of defense was pushed back below the 38th parallel. General MacArthur could scarcely believe that the Chinese Communists would dare to risk the massive retaliation of the United States atomic bombing Air Force by this inexcusable assault on UN forces. However, what he did not know, but soon discovered, was the appalling fact that the Chinese had already been assured by their intelligence agents that the diplomats in Washington, London, and New York were not going to allow MacArthur to retaliate with the U.S. Air Force. MacArthur was going to be restricted to limited warfare. It was in this hour that General MacArthur found that pro-communist forces in the UN and left-wing sympathizers in the State Department were swamping the policies of the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and those who had charge of the Korean War. He found that vast supplies which he badly needed were being diverted to Europe in accordance with point number 1 of the State Department Conference. He was specifically restricted from following Chinese jets to their bases or bombing the Manchurian Railroad, which was dumping mountains of supplies on the north banks of the Yalu River. He was forbidden to bomb the Yalu Bridge over which troops and supplies were funneled, and his own supplies and replacements were cut back to the point where a counteroffensive became strategically difficult, if not impossible. The final blow came when diplomats flatly turned down Chiang Kai-shek's enthusiastic offer to send thousands of trained nationalist troops from Formosa to fight in Korea. Over a period of 4 months, General MacArthur watched the slaughter resulting from these stalemate policies. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. He violated a presidential gag order dated December 6, 1950, and answered a written inquiry from Congressman Joseph W. Martin concerning the inexplicable reverses which UN forces were suffering in Korea. The general's letter giving recommendations for the winning of the war was read in Congress April 5, 1951, and 5 days later, President Truman ordered MacArthur summarily withdrawn from all commands. General MacArthur was relieved by General Matthew B. Ridgway, and he returned to the United States completely perplexed by the sudden termination of his military career. It was not until he landed in San Francisco and met the first wave of shouting, cheering, admiring fellow citizens that he realized that the sickness in the American body politic was not in all its members, but only in one corner of its head. It will be recalled that 2 more years of military stagnation followed the recall of General MacArthur. Subsequently, hearings before congressional committees permitted General Mark Clark, General George E. Stratemeyer, General James A. Van Fleet, Admiral Charles Joy, and others to explain what happened to their commands in Korea. Each one verified the fact that the military was never permitted to fight a winning war. The diplomats had imposed upon them a theory called communist containment, which in actual operation resulted in the containment of the UN fighting forces instead of the communists. It soon became apparent that the Korean War had been run by the same team and according to the same policies as those which resulted in the fall of China. It was also to be revealed at a later date that not only had the machinations of confused diplomats contributed to the semi-defeat in Korea, but that full-time undercover agents of Soviet Russia had often stood at the elbows of officials in London, Washington, and at the UN in New York to argue the Moscow line. Among the high-level spies for Russia during this critical period were 2 top British diplomats, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess. Maclean was head of the American desk in Britain's diplomatic headquarters at London. Burgess was the second secretary of the British Embassy in Washington. Both fled behind the Iron Curtain when they were about to be arrested by British intelligence. The Korean Armistice. By the time President Eisenhower took office in January 1953, there was a general feeling of gloom and despair concerning Korea. The people desperately desired to somehow stop the bloodshed. The hopes for peace were suddenly accelerated by a news flash of March 5th, which swept round the world. Joseph Stalin was dead. The next day, a new government took over in Russia, and the leader turned out to be Stalin's former secretary and the keeper of the secret communist files, Georgy Malenkov. He had seized power by joining forces with Lavrenti P. Beria, head of the secret police, who had an army of agents and troops numbering 2 million. Beria also had charge of the forced labor camps and supervised the atomic energy plants. However, when Malenkov and Beria took over as heirs of Stalin, they immediately found themselves confronted by an explosive economic crisis. Pressure was building up inside Russia and her satellites, just as it did in 1922 and again in 1932. Malenkov therefore offered respite to his people. Let us now lay heavy industry aside for a while. The people cannot eat heavy industry. We should care for the needs of our people. This was the beginning of a radical new policy for the USSR. At home, the slogan was, "More food." Abroad, Malenkov's slogan was a campaign for peaceful coexistence with all the democracies. It was just 23 days after Stalin died that the Communist Chinese acted on their new signals and opened negotiations with the UN commanders for an armistice. This finally led to the signing of a truce on July 27, 1953. It became effective 12 days later. Thus ended the Korean War. It had cost the United States $20 billion and more than 135,000 casualties. It had cost South Korea 1 million dead, another million maimed and wounded, 9 million left homeless, and saddled South Korea with 4 million refugees from North Korea. The U.S. summarily abandons its 20-year policy of appeasement. The people of the United States came out of the Korean War sadder and wiser than when they went in. Authorities have stated that 2 things happened in the Korean War which may yet brand it as the greatest blunder the communist strategists ever made. First, it awakened the United States to the necessity of vigorously rearming and staying armed so long as the communist threat exists. Second, it demonstrated to the people of the United States the inherent weaknesses of the United Nations. As Senator Robert A. Taft summed it up, the United Nations serves a very useful purpose as a town meeting of the world, but it is an impossible weapon against forcible aggression. Back in 1950, when the UN called on all its members to furnish the means to resist the communists, only 16 countries responded with the highly essential ingredient of armed troops. Altogether, these 16 nations furnished an army of 35,000 fighting men. Little South Korea maintained a fighting force of 400,000 men, while the United States made up the difference by furnishing a force of 350,000. More than 1 million American GIs had to be rotated through Korea to maintain the U.S. quota of military strength. In the mind of the average American, the UN had therefore ceased to represent collective security. It was difficult to forget that while Americans and South Koreans were taking the brunt of the war, Russia and Britain had both violated the UN embargo by shipping strategic materials to Red China. On the floor of the UN, Andrei Vyshinsky had thrown down the Russian challenge. The Soviet Union has never concealed the fact that it sold and continues to sell armaments to its ally, China. The end of the Korean War marked the end of an era. During the summer of 1953, the United States served notice on Britain and France that if the communists broke the ceasefire agreement in Korea, we would immediately launch a major war against China. Both Britain and France agreed to support this stand. Many did not realize it at the time, but by this action, the United States was passing the death sentence on a 20-year-old policy of communist appeasement. The role of the FBI in the Battle of the Underground. No one could have welcomed the end of appeasement with greater relief than John Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI and the #1 law enforcement personality in the United States. Since 1919, he had struggled to illuminate the minds of government leaders as well as the public generally concerning the conspiratorial nature of communism. As an assistant to the Attorney General in 1919, he had prepared one of the first legal briefs reflecting the subversive aspects of the worldwide communist movement. During the 20 years of appeasement, when many Americans had been lulled into a sense of security by the sweet talk of Communist United Front propaganda, John Edgar Hoover had struck out with two-fisted blows at the Red Menace which was gnawing at the vitals of American life. The American Communist must be placed in the same category as the Ku Klux Klan, the now defunct German-American Bund, and other totalitarian groups. As common criminals seek the cover of darkness, communists, behind the protection of false fronts, carry on their sinister and vicious program, intent on swindling and robbing Americans of their heritage of freedom. John Edgar Hoover was a great disappointment to the communists. In most countries, the Red leaders had been able to completely discredit the agencies handling the police powers of government by blasting them with charges of corruption and violation of civil liberties. However, the director of the FBI had spent his adult lifetime building the FBI so that the public would know that any such charges would be false and fraudulent. Over the years, the public had learned that FBI agents spent as much time checking out innocent suspects as they spent in ferreting out the guilty. In fact, by careful investigation and humane treatment of the guilty, the FBI had secured confessions in 85% of its cases. Therefore, the communists were deeply disappointed with the results of their campaign to portray the FBI as an American Gestapo. The communist leaders were further embittered by the knowledge that the FBI had trained its personnel to be just what governmental officers in a free nation should be: alert, intelligent, scientific, and hard-working. And what particularly frightened the Reds was the quiet, methodical way in which Bureau agents went after subversives, all of which foreshadowed a day of reckoning for communist strategists. It came July 20th, 1948, when all the top leaders of the Communist Party of America were indicted. The Big 11 who stood trial were all convicted. 6 of their attorneys were also fined or imprisoned for contemptuous conduct during the trial. 4 of the 11 communists jumped their $20,000 bail bond, and the FBI had to launch an international investigation to have them returned. Shortly afterwards, the government became convinced that Soviet espionage agents had been stealing atomic information, and the FBI was given jurisdiction. Within weeks, the FBI had gristed through tons of records, interviewed hundreds of restricted employees at various atomic energy plants, and emerged from the slow elimination process to point the finger of justice at a physicist, Klaus Fuchs, who had spent considerable time at Los Alamos. However, at that moment, the German-born, naturalized Britisher was the dignified director of England's atomic energy establishment at Harwell. Acting on the FBI tip that Klaus Fuchs was the principal suspect in the subversion of the free world's monopoly of the atomic bomb, British intelligence went to work. Within 1 month, they saw some evidence that the FBI might be right. After another month, they had no doubt about it. On February 3, 1949, the British announced that Fuchs had been arrested and had made a full confession. Fuchs's confession sent the FBI on another hunt. Fuchs said he gave packets of information dealing with the atomic bomb to a person known to him only as Raymond. This person had to be identified and located since he was apparently the courier who delivered the bomb secrets to the Soviet consulate in New York. Although the FBI had nothing to start with but a physical description, a phony name, and the possibility that the courier might be a chemist, agents finally came up with the right man. It was Harry Gold. Harry Gold confessed, and this enabled the FBI to finally unravel the answer to a question which had puzzled the whole nation. How did the Russians get hold of information on the ingenious trigger mechanism of the atomic bomb, which should have taken the Russians many years to discover? Harry Gold said they stole it. The FBI once more took up the trail, and this time it led to the doorstep of two U.S. citizens, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The investigation revealed that Julius Rosenberg had pressured his young brother-in-law, David Greenglass, to turn over to Harry Gold himself all the basic information about the trigger device, without which the bomb could not be exploded. David Greenglass worked at the Atomic Energy Laboratory at Los Alamos and had a rather intimate knowledge of the construction of the bomb and the lens apparatus by which it was detonated. Greenglass was finally induced to draw up sketches of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and to provide detailed drawings of the detonator lens. The Rosenbergs then channeled this information into the regular Russian espionage apparatus. As soon as the communist scientists received this data, they quickly closed the gap in the atomic race and exploded a Russian bomb. It will be recalled that this came as a great shock to the startled West. The Red leaders capitalized on this temporary advantage by rattling their atomic sabers and telling the communist leaders in China and North Korea to start casting about for some early military conquest. Eagerly they went to work preparing for the Korean War. In fact, by the time Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had been convicted and were ready for sentence, the United States was in the midst of the Korean conflict. Thousands of American lives were being sacrificed to hold back the tide of desolation which the Rosenbergs had helped to turn loose. Judge Irving Robert Kaufman looked down at this man and woman and said, "Plain, deliberate, contemplated murder is dwarfed in magnitude by comparison with the crime you have committed. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal you undoubtedly have altered the course of history. What I am about to say is not easy for me. I have deliberated for hours, days, and nights. I have searched the records. I have searched my conscience to find some reason for mercy, for it is only human to be merciful, and it is natural to try and spare lives. I am convinced, however, that I would violate the solemn and sacred trust that people of this land have placed in my hands were I to show leniency to the defendants Rosenberg. It is not in my power, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, to forgive you. Only the Lord can find mercy for what you have done. You are hereby sentenced to the punishment of death." David Greenglass was sentenced to 15 years. It was a tragic chapter in American history, but it verified Mr. Hoover's original assertion that the Red leaders carry on their sinister and vicious program intent on swindling and robbing Americans of their heritage of freedom. But John Edgar Hoover knew that the communist revolutionists would never try to strike their final deadly blow at the United States as long as they were losing the battle of the underground. He also felt that carefully selected and carefully trained young Americans could match stratagems with the Red leaders and win. The history of the FBI during Mr. Hoover's remarkable administration gives ample justification for his feelings of enthusiasm and complete confidence in the ultimate victory of America's underground soldiers of freedom. The crack in the Iron Curtain. By 1953, the Kremlin was not only suffering embarrassment abroad, but a wide crack in the Iron Curtain revealed that the Communist Empire was in desperate straits at home. The myth of communist strength and unity was uncovered. In East Germany, riots broke out as the people faced tanks with bricks and bare hands. To make matters worse, insubordinate Russian officers and soldiers had to be executed for refusing to fire into the German crowds. A rash of uprisings also broke out in Czechoslovakia and threatened to break out in Poland, Bulgaria, and the Ukraine. Economists discovered from admissions of Malenkov in his speeches and official releases that Russians were working 38 hours a week for food that only took 26 hours to earn in 1928. Furthermore, Russia, with a substantial increase in population, was producing less food under state socialism than she had produced under the NEP in 1928. The riots in the satellite countries were the result of the realization that Russia would probably never fulfill her propaganda promise to furnish them food, clothing, and machinery. On the contrary, the bankrupt USSR had been feeding like a great parasite on the satellite countries. In contrast to the Iron Curtain countries, the Western European nations were enjoying the greatest period of prosperity in 40 years. The American people had donated $50 billion to the post-war recovery of these countries, and they were rapidly reaching the point where they could begin to stand alone. There was a healthy resurgence of faith in free enterprise capitalism as the United States reached the zenith of its prosperity and demonstrated its capacity to not only produce more wealth than any other nation, but to distribute it more equitably among its people. A leading socialist at Britain, Professor W. Arthur Lewis, openly acknowledged that socialism had been a great disappointment in England. What has been done is to transfer property not to the workers, but to the government. Workers continue to be employees, subject to all the frustrations of working under orders in large undertakings. Those who expected nationalization to raise wages have been disappointed. It does not solve the problem of labor relations. It reduces private wealth. It raises unsolved problems of control, and it raises the issue of how much power we want our government to have. The Communist Conquest in Indochina. After the Korean armistice, the Chinese Communists did not allow Russia's domestic problems to dull their appetite for further aggression. They marched off to complete the Red Conquest of Indochina. Originally, the war in Indochina had been an attempt by the native population to free itself from French colonialism. However, Red infiltration by the Communist Chinese had finally changed the conflict from a war for freedom to a war between France and the Chinese Reds. The compromising influence of the French Communist Party, the largest single party in France, made the fatal outcome of the war dependent only on the passing of time. Defeat to the French came on July 21, 1954. At Geneva, the Red Chinese jubilantly agreed to stop fighting in exchange for 12 million people and 61,000 square miles of Indochina. Mao Zedong was now intoxicated with double success. Even Russia felt it necessary to make concessions to Mao and his Chinese communists in order to ensure their continued loyalty to the communist motherland. In October 1954, Russian officials trekked to Peiping and flattered Mao with the following promises. 1. To evacuate Port Arthur, which Russia was authorized to lease at Yalta. 2. To sell to China, on easy terms, the railroads and other industries which Russia had been operating since the war as a partner. 3. To loan China $130 million. 4. To help build 2 railroads across China. 5. To help China build 15 new heavy industrial projects. 6. To campaign for the seizure of Formosa. 7. To campaign for the inclusion of Japan in the communist orbit. It was apparent that even though Russia was talking peaceful coexistence, the free world would have little relief from the war-making plans of Red China. The task of isolating a world aggressor. From the point of view of the United States, the Indochina fiasco was a dismal political tragedy. The 100 communists in the French Parliament, who even refused to stand in tribute to the French war dead, engineered the collapse of the 7-Year War. As the U.S. Secretary of State addressed the armistice meeting at Geneva, he lashed out at the cowardice and subversion which had sacrificed 12 million more human beings to red aggression. Peace, he said, is always easy to achieve by surrender. Unity is also easy to achieve by surrender. The hard task, the task that confronts us, is to combine peace and unity with freedom. Secretary Dulles left Geneva to carry out a feverish round-the-world campaign to get all free nations to make an agonizing reappraisal of the ridiculous concessions which were being made to communist imperialism. In 20 months, he covered over 152,000 miles, and when he was through, the United States had become a party to, or strengthens its position in, a chain of regional compacts specifically designed to reinforce communist containment. To the dismay of the Soviet strategists, Article 52 of the UN Charter contained a loophole which permitted this procedure. Therefore, the United States openly began to use NATO, CETO, and similar regional organizations as collective agencies for mutual security. To a large extent, this nullified the paralyzing chokehold which the Soviets had previously held on the West through its abusive use of the veto power in the UN Security Council. The United States also announced that she did not intend to sit back and watch Russia construct its armada of long-range bombers, which communist press releases described as capable of dropping H-bombs on American cities. The U.S. answer to this was the rapid construction of a ring of U.S. defense bases on the fringe of the Iron Curtain. Immediately, the roar of an injured bear came thundering out of Russia. We are being threatened with annihilation. Secretary Dulles soberly reaffirmed a truth which he was well aware the communists already knew, namely, that no nation need fear these bases except as an aggressor. Then he expounded in clear-cut, hard-hitting terminology the new U.S. doctrine of massive retaliation, which he warned would be triggered instantly in case the Soviet Empire dared fulfill its oft-repeated threat of a surprise attack on the free world. For a while, there was an ominous silence in Moscow. Russia tests the new U.S. Get Tough policy. Toward the latter part of 1954, it became apparent that serious political adjustments were going on inside Russia. A bellicose, bullet-headed personality named Nikita S. Khrushchev and a punctilious party politician named Nikolai Bulganin began to appear more frequently in the news. An ex-Soviet official, Nikolai E. Kokolov, declared this to be a bad sign. He described Khrushchev and Bulganin as promoters of world communism, in contrast to Malenkov and Beria, who wanted first to improve living conditions for Russians. In the fall of 1954, Khrushchev and Bulganin led a delegation to Peiping. There the Chinese were given instructions to prepare for an assault on Formosa. From this, it became apparent that completely new lines of power had been drawn in Russia. Eventually, it came out that Malenkov had deserted his partner Beria and joined forces with the new Khrushchev-Bulganin forces. In the latter part of December, Beria and 3 of his aides were shot. Malenkov was summarily demoted, but he had switched sides in time to save his life. Bulganin took his place, and Khrushchev hovered in the background, setting policy and announcing the new slogans: return to heavy industry, armaments, and the growing of food by decree. Meanwhile, the Chinese communists had also caught the spirit of the new leadership and began fronting for Moscow by tantalizing the democracies with the shocking announcement that they had deliberately held back U.S. officers and men in violation of the prisoner exchange agreement at the close of the Korean War. The armistice agreement at Panmunjom had specifically provided that all UN prisoners who desired repatriation would be returned, even though some of them might be charged with some crime. Now, however, the Chinese communists were defiantly announcing that they had secretly held back a number of American prisoners because they were charged with espionage or some other type of crime. U.S. indignation reached a white heat as many Americans began to realize for the first time how completely impossible it is to depend on a communist pledge. In spite of public indignation, however, American feelings were somewhat compromised at this particular moment by a rapidly growing desire on the part of many citizens to forget the whole foreign mess and get on with home front developments which promised to provide an all-time record of American free enterprise prosperity. Mao Zedong accurately diagnosed this national feeling as an anti-war sentiment, and he therefore accelerated his campaign of propaganda throughout Asia by representing the United States as a paper tiger. He taunted the United States with additional disclosures of illegally held American prisoners of war, and by open implication boastfully defied the United States government to try and do something about it. He became so enthusiastic in his campaign that he finally decided to prove the impotency of American influence to all the world by acting on Khrushchev's fighting orders and strike at Formosa. In a matter of weeks, the offshore islands in the hands of the nationalists began to be bombed from the Chinese mainland. It was the preliminary phase of an all-out attack on Chiang Kai-shek's last outpost. This was a highly critical hour for the United States, since she had committed herself to defend Formosa. If she wavered, the light of freedom could very easily go out in Southeast Asia. 1/2 billion neutral Asians also watched keenly as U.S. leaders measured the risk and fathomed the depths of their own moral convictions. Early in February 1955, the Chinese Reds and the other world communists got their answer. It was a U.S. congressional resolution supported by both parties which confirmed the authority of the President of the United States to throw the 7th Fleet into the Formosa Straits and give orders to wage an all-out war if attacked. This would obviously include the use of nuclear weapons. The little nations of Southeast Asia stood up and cheered. It was apparent that the U.S. not only had the will to talk massive retaliation, but the will to wage it. At the Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung, several of the little nations boldly showed their colors. They badgered the Chinese communist delegates with cries of communist colonialism and communist aggression. It was a severe blow to the prestige and propaganda of Mao Zedong and his communist backers in Moscow. Within a matter of weeks, the stand-firm policy of the U.S. and her Pacific allies began bearing miraculous fruit. Orders went out from Moscow that coexistence was once more the sweet theme of the hour. The Chinese began releasing U.S. prisoners they had held illegally. The issue of Formosa was allowed to slip quietly into the background. Khrushchev extended an invitation to the United States to exchange visitors. Editors, congressmen, farmers. He even said he might come himself sometime. All over the world, the hard-knuckled tension of the 10 post-war years began to subside. There seemed to be general satisfaction with the new and unexpected turn of events throughout the world, and the democracies settled back once more to the pursuit of their own normal domestic affairs. But in the midst of it all came a sinister warning from military intelligence. Reports indicated that while the emphasis of soft policies toward the democracies was being promoted abroad, a tough imperialistic policy was being fed to the troops at home. Soviet troops were being taught that the importance of the surprise factor in contemporary war has increased enormously, and the Communist Party demands that the whole personnel of our Army and Navy should be imbued with the spirit of maximum vigilance and constant and high military preparedness, so as to be able to wrest the initiative from the hands of the enemy and, having delivered smashing blows against him, finally defeat him completely. All this had a familiar spirit. It reminded alert Americans of a significant statement made by Dmitry Z. Manuilsky, who represented the USSR in presiding over the Security Council of the United Nations in 1949. At the Lenin School of Political Warfare in Moscow, he had taught, "War to the hilt between communism and capitalism is inevitable. Today, of course, we are not strong enough to attack. To win, we shall need the element of surprise. The bourgeoisie will have to be put to sleep. So we shall begin by launching the most spectacular peace movements on record. There will be electrifying overtures and unheard-of concessions. The capitalist countries, stupid and decadent, will rejoice to cooperate in their own destruction. They will leap at another chance to be friends. As soon as their guard is down, we shall smash them with our clenched fist. End of Chapter 9, Part 2. Chapter 10 of The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Communism under Khrushchev. By 1955, it was vividly apparent that the most vicious kind of political infighting was being waged in Moscow by the communist contestants for Stalin's throne. Already Beria and his aides had been shot. There were signs of vast power shifts behind the scenes, and out of the rancor and roar of the secret battle in the Kremlin, the personality which seemed to be emerging on top of the conspiratorial heap was Nikita Khrushchev. Of all the contenders for power in Russia, Khrushchev was probably the least well-known in the West. Therefore, a U.S. congressional committee decided to get the Khrushchev story. They invited anyone who had known Khrushchev to come in and testify. A stream of witnesses responded, but the story they told was gruesome and ugly. The hopes of many Western diplomats for improved Russian relations collapsed as they heard the record of the Red leader with whom free men would now have to deal. Here was no ordinary communist politician or party hack. Khrushchev was revealed to be a creature of criminal cunning with an all-consuming passion for power. Khrushchev as the director of the Ukraine. Many of the witnesses told of the early days when Khrushchev was first grasping for power and recognition. They revealed that his loyalty to communism was the blind, senseless kind. Having been raised almost an illiterate, Khrushchev did not get his elementary education until after he had become a full-grown adult. As a boy, he had been a shepherd, later learning the trade of blacksmith and locksmith. At 17, he ran away from the obscure Ukrainian village of Kalinovka, where he had been born April 17, 1894. For several years, Khrushchev was a roaming, itinerant worker, but in 1918 he joined the Communist Party and fought with the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. In 1922, he commenced his first formal education, which lasted 3 years. By 1929, his dogged party loyalty had won him a berth in the Joseph Stalin Industrial Academy, and by 1931 he had become a local party official in Moscow. Khrushchev soon won favor with Stalin by joining in a drive to purge Stalin's enemies from the local party machinery. More than 500 men and women were turned over to the secret police for execution. Later, Stalin said that while Khrushchev was repulsive to him, he was impressed with the Ukrainians' capacity to kill or turn on old friends when party policy demanded it. Stalin therefore assigned Khrushchev the task of going back to the Ukraine and forcing his own people to live under the lash of total communist suppression. The Red leaders had been using wholesale executions to stifle resistance. Khrushchev said he had a better way. He would use mass starvation. Witnesses to this man-made famine told of the suffering and death. Nicholas Prichodowsko. I observed covered wagons moving along the street on which I lived and also on other streets in Kiev. They were hauling corpses for disposal. These were peasants who flocked to the cities for some crust of bread. My personal friend was a surgeon at a hospital in the Ukraine. He put a white frock on me, just as he was in a white frock, and we went outside to a very large garage in the hospital area. He and I entered it. When he switched on the light, I saw 2,000 to 3,000 corpses laid along the walls. Mr. Ahrens, what caused the death of these people? Mr. Prichodowsko, starvation. Mr. Ahrens, what caused the starvation? Mr. Prichodowsko, we found some statistics in hiding places in the cellar of the Academy of Sciences. They revealed that the food in 1932 was sufficient to feed all Ukrainians for 2 years and 4 months. But except for about 10%, the crop was immediately dispatched from the threshing machines for export to parts outside Ukraine. That was the cause of the hunger. Mr. Ahrens, why did the communist regime seize the crops in Ukraine during this period? Mr. Prichodoko, because at all times there was various kinds of resistance to the communist government in Ukraine and the collectivization drive in Moscow. Mr. Ahrens, how many people were starved to death by this man-made famine in Ukraine in the 30s? Mr. Prichodoko, it is estimated to be 6 to 7 million, most of them peasants. Witnesses testified that after millions of lives had been destroyed under Khrushchev's administration, the collectivized farms were finally set up. Khrushchev was rewarded in 1934 when Stalin appointed him to the powerful Central Committee of the Communist hierarchy in Moscow. However, because of continued unrest and resistance to communism, Khrushchev was sent back to the Ukraine as its political dictator in 1938. Once again, the people were subjected to a vast purge. So violently did they react to this new barbarity that when World War II broke out and the Nazis moved in, the Germans were welcomed by the Ukrainians as liberators. Nikita Khrushchev never forgave them for that. Before fleeing toward Moscow, he poured out his vengeance against them. Official reports show that when the Nazis arrived, they found numerous mass graves. In one area alone, there were over 90 mammoth burial plots containing approximately 10,000 bodies of peasants, workers, and priests, each with hands tied behind the back and a bullet in the head. After the Germans were driven out in 1944, Khrushchev once more returned to the Ukraine, grimly determined to annihilate all collaborationalists. Whole segments of the population were deported. A complete liquidation of the principal Christian churches was launched, people's leaders were arrested and executed, and the NKVD was turned loose on the populace with a terrible ferocity intended to terrorize the people and eliminate all resistance to the communist reoccupation. Hangman of the Ukraine became the people's title for Nikita Khrushchev. By 1949, Khrushchev had so completely demonstrated his total dedication to Stalin that he was returned to Moscow as the secretary of the powerful Central Committee. He was then given the assignment of trying to make the sluggish centralized farms produce more food. Khrushchev used terror tactics to get more work and more produce, but he failed. Khrushchev could raise only enough food to keep the people at a bare subsistence level. This was the status of Khrushchev at the time of Stalin's death. How Khrushchev seized power. When Stalin died, March 5, 1953, he left a bristling nest of problems for his quarreling communist comrades. Each Red leader carefully eyed his competitors, weighing the possibility of seizing power. Khrushchev immediately went to work maneuvering for a position of strategic strength. Compared to the other Red leaders, Khrushchev was described both inside and outside of Russia as low man on the totem pole. The first in terms of strength was Malenkov, secretary of Stalin, who had charge of all secret communist files. It was said that he had collected so much damning evidence on the others that they tried to curry his favor by pushing him forward as the temporary head of the government. The second in line was Beria, hated leader of the secret police and an administrator of the nuclear development program, all of which gave him a hardcore force of 2 million armed men. The third in line was Molotov, intimate Bolshevik associate of Stalin himself and the most shrewd, deceptive diplomat Soviet Russia had ever produced. The fourth in line was Bulganin, official representative of the Communist Party in the Red Army and therefore the Red Army's principal politician. The fifth in line was Khrushchev, head of the state collectivized farms. Many people did not take Khrushchev seriously. They thought of him merely as the paunchy, bullet-headed hatchet man of Stalin. But Khrushchev took himself seriously. Doggedly and desperately, he pushed for every possible personal advantage. His method was to use an old communist trick, which is the very opposite of divide and conquer. His technique was to unite and conquer. First, he united with Premier Malenkov. he convinced Malenkov that Beria was his greatest threat, his greatest enemy. In December 1954, Beria and his associates were arrested and shot. Now Khrushchev united with Bulganin to get rid of Malenkov. Khrushchev told the bearded political army leader that he, Bulganin, should be premier instead of Malenkov. Bulganin heartily agreed. Immediately there was a shift of power behind the scenes which permitted Bulganin to replace Malenkov by the spring of 1955. Molotov was the next to fall. He had no machine in back of him, but had depended upon his prestige as Stalin's partner. Suddenly he found himself exiled to the Mongolian border. Now the partnership of Bulganin and Khrushchev began running the entire communist complex. But Khrushchev was not through. His next step was to persuade Bulganin to force Marshal Zhukov of World War II fame into retirement and to demote other key officials in the government. Some of these officials were the very ones who had originally sponsored Khrushchev's promotions in previous years. Suddenly they found themselves politically emasculated. By destroying his friends as well as his enemies, Khrushchev felt he was preventing them from regrouping and ousting him the way he was ousting them. Finally, Khrushchev was prepared for the big step, to oust Bulganin. By forcing Bulganin to get rid of Marshal Zhukov, Khrushchev created a rift between Bulganin and his main source of support, the Red Army. This allowed Khrushchev to move into the breach and fill powerful key positions with his own followers. By 1956, Bulganin found himself the captive puppet of Khrushchev. For 2 more years, Khrushchev ran the government through Bulganin, but there was no question whatever as to who was in line for Stalin's throne. Such was Nikita Khrushchev's slippery and dangerous ascent to the summit. But all of these battles in the Kremlin and the resulting shift of power had not solved the terrifying economic problems which continued to plague Soviet socialism. Nowhere in China, Russia, or the satellites was communism proving successful. Uprisings had been occurring for over 3 years in the communist-controlled countries. Heavy Soviet armament had to be maintained in all of them. Just as Khrushchev was consolidating his power in 1956, a major satellite cut loose and struck for freedom. The Hungarian Revolution, 1956. While bargaining for American Lend-Lease during World War II, Stalin had promised that any nation coming under the domination of the Red Army during the war would be allowed free elections and self-determination after the war. Hungary was the first nation to demand self-government and the overthrow of the communist regime. Perhaps no better historical example exists to illustrate the extreme treachery to which Khrushchev would extend himself than the Hungarian Revolution. On the 23rd of October, 1956, a massive but peaceful demonstration took place in Budapest with thousands of people participating. The people said they wanted to end Soviet colonial rule and set up a democratic government with free elections. When the crowds refused to disband, the Russian secret police were ordered to fire on them. Thus the revolution began. The first major action of the revolution was toppling down the huge statue of Stalin, the symbol of Soviet domination. The freedom fighters then hoisted the Hungarian flag on the stump. Soviet occupation troops were immediately ordered to smash the revolution, but they were resisted by communist-trained Hungarian troops who defected and joined the freedom fighters. Many of the Soviet occupation troops also defected. As a result, the remaining Soviet troops were beaten in 5 days. Then General Bela Kirali describes what happened. To avoid annihilation of the Soviet units, Khrushchev himself carried out one of his most sinister actions. He sent to Budapest his first deputy, Mikoyan, and he sent Mr. Suslov from the party leadership. These 2 Soviet men sat down with the revolutionary government. They found out they were defeated. After talking with Khrushchev by means of the telephone and by the approval of Khrushchev, they concluded an armistice. Diplomatic actions were further developed. It was positively declared that the aim of further diplomatic negotiations would be how to withdraw the Soviet troops from Hungary and how to allow Hungary to regain her national independence. The Soviet representatives proposed that final details be drawn up at the Soviet headquarters in Tokol, a village south of Budapest. The entire Hungarian delegation was therefore invited to come and discuss the precise date when Soviet troops would leave Hungary. In response to this invitation, the elated and victorious Hungarians went to the Soviet headquarters. To their amazement, they were suddenly surrounded, seized, and imprisoned. Simultaneously, a new all-out attack was ordered by Khrushchev against the whole Hungarian population. The new Soviet attack was in the form of a massive invasion. It involved 5,000 tanks and 250,000 soldiers. They poured in from Czechoslovakia, Russia, and Romania. On Sunday, November 4th, 1956, the radio station in Budapest pleaded, "People of the world, listen to our call. Help us. Please do not forget that this wild attack of Bolshevism will not stop. You may be the next victim. Save us. SOS. SOS." A little later, the voice said, "People of the civilized world, in the name of liberty and solidarity, we are asking you to help. Our ship is sinking. The light vanishes. The shadows grow darker from hour to hour. Listen to our cry. God be with you and with us." That was all. The station went off the air. As the student of history contemplates those tragic days, he cannot help but wonder, where was the conscience of the Free West? Where was the UN? Where were the forces of NATO? What had happened to the whole fabric of gilded promises of the UN made at San Francisco in 1945? To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, to establish respect for the obligations arising from treaties, to ensure that armed force shall not be used. Preamble UN Charter. As it turned out, the massacre of tens of thousands of Hungarians finally smothered into oblivion the heroic Hungarian fight for freedom. Prime Minister Imre Nagy was executed. Most of the other leaders of the revolution were deported to Russia and never heard of again. In the UN Security Council, America's Ambassador Lodge introduced a resolution proposing that Russia be censured for this atrocious Hungarian attack. Russia vetoed it. This amazing and treacherous series of events was personally supervised by Nikita Khrushchev. Without any serious challenge whatever, he was allowed to carry out, in direct violation of the Yalta Agreement, the Warsaw Pact, and the first two articles of the UN Charter. It was the greatest opportunity the Western Bloc had ever had to show whether or not the mighty and strong had the courage to expel Russia and then put the high-sounding phrases of the UN to work. Instead, the UN appointed a committee to gather the facts, prepare a report, and then submit it to the General Assembly. This gave pro-Soviet forces an additional chance to pull sensitive strings in the UN and further obscure the vicious conquest of Hungary. The UN investigation of the Hungarian Revolution. The average American has no conception of the deep penetration of the communist conspiracy inside the United Nations. A Danish diplomat, Povel Bang-Jensen, said he began feeling strong communist pressures soon after he started serving as the Deputy Secretary of the UN Committee which was investigating the Russian attack on Hungary. He claimed pro-Soviet influence came sweeping down upon him from the Secretary General's office and even from many of the committee members. Bang-Jensen did not know where to turn for help. Finally, he started writing protests both to the committee and the Secretary General. He pointed out errors in the report which would allow the Russians to discredit it. He said the committee chairman had refused to correct these errors. He stated that important facts were being eliminated, which established the official responsibility of the Russian government for what had happened. He also noted that the committee was going soft in its treatment of János Kadar, who headed up the new communist puppet government in Hungary. But most of all, Povel Bang-Jensen was outraged when the Secretary General demanded that he reveal the secret list of Hungarian witnesses. He had been authorized in writing to tell the witnesses that their names would never be disclosed, since this would bring cruel and immediate reprisal on their families in Hungary. Bang Jensen stood by this commitment. He declared that turning over the names to the UN Secretariat would permit possible leaks to the Russians. The word was already getting around to the UN that Russian agents were offering extravagant bribes to anyone who would get them to the list. Suddenly, Bang Jensen found the UN Secretariat and the investigating committee attacking him personally. Instead of dealing with the issues, high UN officials began describing Povel Bang Jensen as mentally ill. 3 leading American employees in the UN participated in the attack on Bang Jensen. They were Andrew Wellington Cordier, a former associate of Alger Hiss who had become number 2 man in the UN, Ernest A. Gross, who had tried to get the United States to allow recognition of Red China, and Dr. Ralph Bunche, UN Undersecretary, who was one of the first to put the mentally ill label on Bang Jensen in an official memorandum. Gradually, Povel Bang Jensen felt himself going down under the avalanche of opposition. When the UN officials could not force him to disclose the secret list of Hungarian witnesses, he was ordered to burn them in the presence of a UN representative. This he did. Then they fired him. Pavel Bang Jensen was discharged by Dag Hammarskjöld on December 4, 1957. Nevertheless, the UN pressure against Bang Jensen as a mentally ill person continued. Derogatory reports from the UN prevented him from securing several highly important positions. For some time, Bang Jensen had also feared the possibility of physical harm. He had been a Danish underground fighter against the Nazis and Communists in World War II and was familiar with the technique of doing away with an enemy by making it look like a suicide. Therefore, he wrote the following note to his wife on November 30, 1957. Under no circumstances whatsoever would I ever commit suicide. This would be contrary to my whole nature and to my religious convictions. If any note was found to the opposite effect in my handwriting, it would be a fake. It was Thanksgiving Day, 1959, that the body of Pavel Bang Jensen was found in a secluded area 2 miles from his home with a bullet hole in his head. A pistol and a scribbled note were by his side. He had left home 72 hours earlier to catch a bus. The coroner found he had been dead only a few hours. What had happened during that tragic interval of 2 days or more while Bang Jensen was still alive? Professional investigators suspected murder. If so, it was carefully executed to look like a suicide. And suicide was the final official verdict. Many remained unconvinced. But by this time, the UN investigation of the Hungarian Revolution had long since been completed. The expurgated, distorted, and watered-down report had been turned over to the UN and officially accepted by the General Assembly. Inside Khrushchev's Russia. Communism has only one fragile excuse for all the unparalleled brutality, cruelty, and crimes against humanity which it commits. This is the Marx, Engels, Lenin promise that it is the historical shortcut to a better life for all mankind. But even communists are men with minds that seek tangible evidence for the faith they live by. The most bitter reality in the communist hierarchy is the fact that after 40 years of all-out effort, numerous 5-year plans, the purging, executing, torturing, and liquidation of millions of human beings, the communist motherland has still produced little more than a dull and monotonous existence. A 5-year analysis of Russian economics revealed the humiliating fact that less economic progress had been made under 40 years of communism than under the last 40 years of the czars. Although stealing technical knowledge from the West and kidnapping the scientists of vanquished foes has made it possible for the communist leaders to make several spectacular crash exhibitions in the technical field, nevertheless, the plain irrefutable fact remains that Russia just cannot compete with capitalism in massive production. This continues to be a nest of cockleburs in the craw of communist leadership. After 1955, when Americans were finally allowed to visit the Soviet Union, It was observed that the whole socialist production system sloppily squandered vast quantities of manpower. Often, for each man working, another stood idly looking on. Capitalistic work incentives had been introduced to create work motivation, but even so, monolithic socialized planning continued to hold back production schedules and production speed. American tourists with eyes alert to such problems observed that Khrushchev was resorting to child labor to try to make up the difference. In fact, the Russian government admitted it was recruiting students from the schools to work for the farms and factories. Khrushchev announced his plan to limit most Russian youth to 7 or 8 years of schooling and said much of this would be at night. Only very select students would be allowed to go to college. As for the collectivized farms, even with half of the entire Russian population working on socialized farms, the USSR had not been able to do more than feed the people at a bare subsistence level. The fact that the American system permits a mere 12% of the people to produce more than Americans can either eat or sell stuns the comprehension of red farm experts like Khrushchev, and he has made no secret of his resentment. Every so often he lashes out at the sluggish Russian farm program. These are direct quotes from his 1955 speech denouncing Russian agriculture. Lag in production. Intolerable mismanagement. State farms fail to fulfill their plan for an increase. Hay fields remain unharvested. No silo buildings are being erected. Unfortunate situation has arisen with regard to seed. For 6 years, work has been in progress on the design of a tractor, and the tractor has not been designed. Machinery is not being used on many collectivized farms. There is considerable disorder on our state farms. Causes of damage: labor sabotage to trucks and tractors. Absenteeism. Undernourished cattle delivered to the state. Serious shortcomings in pig breeding. Production of milk decreased 10%. Cows bearing calves amount to only 34%. Weight of fattened pigs and wool clippings decreased. Americans succeeded in achieving a high level of stock breeding. In the United States, this crop, corn, gives the highest harvest yield. This was the reason Khrushchev abandoned the last 5-year plan and substituted a 7-year plan. The latest plan is supposed to equal U.S. production by 1965, but in 1961, Khrushchev roared out his anger at the Russian farmers. There had been a continuous slump in farm production for 5 years. The hazardous life of a communist dictator. By 1958, Nikita Khrushchev had officially declared himself the head of the Communist Party and the supreme dictator of all Russia. Nevertheless, he had some cold, hard facts to face. By that time, the red timetable of conquest was at a virtual standstill. The Iron Curtain was surrounded by NATO and CETO defense bases with atomic warheads zeroed in to discourage communist aggression. Mao and Chao, the Red Chinese leaders, were becoming increasingly defiant, critical, and independent. It was taking more than 6 million soldiers and secret police to maintain this state of siege behind the Iron Curtain so as to give the appearance of domestic tranquility. Russia had worn out her good offices in the UN and was beginning to feel the united pressure of the Western Bloc. There was continued unrest in the satellites, and large Red Army garrisons had to be stationed in each of them since the local armies were likely to join any uprising just as they did in Hungary. There was also serious unrest in the Red Army, where deep resentment against Khrushchev's ruthless political decapitation of Marshal Zhukov still existed. Khrushchev had been only partially successful in opening up the world market so that the Sino-Soviet bloc could buy the things which its collectivized economy could not produce. He also faced the unpleasant fact that the Red economy was not in a position to pay for foreign trade because it was continually operating on the brink of bankruptcy. Finally, and most important of all, Khrushchev lived under the constant threat of possible regrouping by disgruntled Red leaders to oust him from power, the same way he had ousted Malenkov and Bulganin. Khrushchev felt a desperate need to boost his personal political status. He determined to achieve this by forcing the United States to honor him with an invitation to visit America. Khrushchev's scheme to force the U.S. to invite him to America. Ever since 1955, Khrushchev had tried to get the United States to invite him to America, but failed. Finally, he decided to accomplish it by creating a crisis over Berlin. In 1958, he issued an ultimatum that America and her allies must get out of West Berlin by a certain date, or he would turn the communist East Germans loose on them. This demand was a flagrant violation of all existing treaties. When President Eisenhower announced that any efforts to force us out of Berlin would be met with military resistance, Khrushchev immediately said he didn't really want war, and that he thought the whole thing could be worked out amicably if he just came to the United States and talked it over with the president. He also mentioned on several occasions that President Eisenhower would be welcome to visit Russia. At first, President Eisenhower demurred. Bringing the communist dictator to the United States was precisely what Secretary Dulles had warned against right up to the time of his death. However, President Eisenhower felt that such a visit might impress Khrushchev with the power of the United States and deter him from hasty military action. Furthermore, the president felt that much good might arise from a visit to Russia by the President of the United States. It would be in furtherance of his own program of people-to-people relations. Therefore, an additional invitation was extended to the communist dictator, making him the first Russian ruler ever to visit the United States. Was Khrushchev's visit a mistake? American strategists on communist problems immediately warned that a serious tactical error was being made. Several of them testified before congressional committees. Eugene Lyons, a senior editor of the Reader's Digest, a biographer of Khrushchev and a former press correspondent in Russia, called the invitation to Khrushchev a terrific victory for communism. Then he continued, "It amounts to a body blow to the morale of the resistance in the communist world. It's a betrayal of the hopes of the enemies of communism within that world, and their numbers can be counted by the 100 million. The announcement of the invitation was a day of gloom and despair for nearly the whole population of every satellite country and for tens of millions inside Russia itself." When asked if Khrushchev's visit to the United States might cause him to slow down or abandon his plans for world conquest, Mr. Lyons replied, "It's a childish fairy tale. The communists in high places are perfectly well informed about our material prosperity and political freedom. Khrushchev is not coming here to confirm his knowledge of our strengths, but to feel out our weaknesses. The notion that he will be impressed by our wealth and liberty to the point of curbing communist ambitions is political innocence carried to extremes. In the first place, the new Soviet boss, despite his homespun exterior, is one of the bloodiest tyrants extant. He has come to power over mountains of corpses. Those of us who roll out red carpets for him will soon have red faces." Even while Khrushchev was on his tour of the United States, Americans felt the icy thrust of numerous snarling threats which crept out between his propaganda boasts, his quaint platitudes, and his offering to swear on the Bible. The press observed that he was supersensitive and hot-tempered about questions on any of the following matters: the ruthless and illegal suppression of the Hungarian revolt after all of Khrushchev's recent preachments about self-determination; questions about his role as the hangman of the Ukraine; questions about Soviet jamming of Voice of America broadcasts; Questions about the continuous flight of thousands of refugees from satellite states. Aftermath of the Khrushchev visit. The whole worldwide program of communist aggression was swiftly accelerated as a result of Khrushchev's visit. The Communist Party in the United States came boldly out into the open. It began a new recruiting program. It openly attacked the House Committee on Un-American Activities and marked the FBI for early dismantling if it succeeded in destroying the congressional committees. Convicted communists from Hollywood cells moved back into the cinema capital and boldly began writing, producing, and propagandizing through multi-million-dollar productions. The president of the Communist Party announced the launching of a nationwide communist youth movement. The same thrust became apparent all over the world, in Japan, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, Cuba, Central and South America. Everywhere the red tide ran stronger. The dire predictions of strategists like John Foster Dulles and Eugene Lyons had been literally fulfilled. Nevertheless, the visit of the Russian dictator to the United States also carried a certain penalty for Khrushchev. This was the devastating effect which could result from President Eisenhower's reciprocal visit to Russia. Khrushchev was deeply impressed with the acclaim which Vice President Nixon received when he visited Russia and the satellites. He knew that if President Eisenhower were granted the same freedom of expression on radio, TV, in public meetings, and in press interviews that Khrushchev had enjoyed in the United States, the pro-communist tide could be reversed. Desperately, Khrushchev looked around for some semblance of an excuse to cancel the Eisenhower visit, almost as though the communists had planned it, and a monumental excuse dropped into Khrushchev's lap right out of the sky. The U-2 incident. On May 1, 1960, Francis G. Powers, piloting an unarmed U-2 jet reconnaissance plane, was captured 1,200 miles inside Russia. The communist leaders triumphantly announced that they had shot down the U-2 spy plane with a marvelous new rocket. This story was discredited when the Russians displayed Powers' undamaged equipment and the U.S. monitors reported hearing the Russian pilots as they followed the plane in a forced landing. Government officials revealed that the U-2 plane came down because of a flameout. In Washington, the incident created consternation. Since Americans were not accustomed to spying, they hardly knew what to do when this plane was caught spying. At first it was simply claimed that the U-2 was a weather plane which must have drifted. Finally, it was rather clumsily admitted that the plane was in fact flying on an espionage mission with the highly important assignment of photographing Russian missile bases. Khrushchev professed outraged indignation, criticized the morals of the American leaders for spying, and denounced the U-2 incident as an act of aggression. He almost immediately announced he was canceling President Eisenhower's visit to Russia. A few days later, he used the U-2 incident to scuttle the Paris Summit Conference. Meanwhile, in America, citizens were peppering Washington with a multitude of questions. Was this an isolated mission or one of many espionage flights? Was it in violation of international law? What did such flights accomplish? Why hadn't the Russians objected to such flights earlier? Should the flights be continued or terminated? Since Russia had now captured one of the U-2 planes and all of its equipment, the U.S. government felt justified in telling the inside facts on this rather ingenious American defense device, which had been operating over Russia and China for more than 4 years. The May 1st flight was one of more than 200 which had been mapping offensive war preparations of the USSR. It was revealed that the U-2s had been ordered aloft in 1956 when the U.S. had first learned that the communist leaders had officially adopted a mammoth sneak attack plan as part of their overall strategy. The planes had been flying over Russia at an altitude of between 12 and 14 miles, far out of reach of any jets or rockets which the Russians possessed. Was this illegal? Since Russia had refused to negotiate any international law on airspace, these flights were not illegal. Ernest K. Lindley summarized the views of Secretary of State Christian Herter. The altitude above the earth to which a nation's sovereignty extends has never been determined by international agreement. The traditional rule is said to be that a nation's sovereignty extends as high as it can exert effective control. By that rule, the U-2 flights were not illegal so long as the planes flew above the reach of Soviet air defenses. Then how effective had the U-2s been? The Defense Secretary told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, "From these flights, we got information on airfields, aircraft, missile testing and training, special weapons storage, submarine production, atomic production, and aircraft deployment." How was this achieved? The Air Force revealed that it was done with high-precision photographic equipment which performed miracles. This equipment could photograph a golf ball from 9 miles up. In fact, a published photograph of a golf course taken from that altitude showed the greens, cars, clubhouse, and players. The picture caption read, "Even golf balls are clearly identifiable to photo interpreters." But Russia and China cover such vast territories. How could precision photography be effective over so wide a terrain? The Air Force answered this question by revealing that this photographic equipment not only had high precision qualities, but was also extremely comprehensive. Officials pointed out that 2 jets carrying these special cameras could photograph 1/3 of the United States in 4 hours. During Khrushchev's verbal blast against the U-2 flights, he let it slip that he had known about these planes for over 3 years. Some people wondered why he had not protested long before. Experts pointed out that if Khrushchev had complained, it would have exploded his propaganda boasts about the invincible strength of Soviet defenses. He had been claiming that Soviet radar, jets, and rockets could prevent any nation from successfully attacking Russia. U-2 photographs had revealed that Russian defenses were wide open to massive retaliatory attack. It was for this reason that Khrushchev had waited until he finally got hold of a U-2 plane so that he could claim the Russians had shot it down. The Communists even succeeded in getting Francis Powers to testify at his Moscow trial that he had been shot down at 68,000 feet. But when his father came from America to visit him, the U-2 pilot said he was not shot down. This seemed to confirm Washington military statements that the Russians had neither jets nor rockets that could reach 68,000 feet. The question of future U-2 flights was finally settled when President Eisenhower agreed that there would be no more. He made it clear that this was not because the flights were illegal or unjustified, but simply that the United States would soon have other means of staying informed about Russian bases. The U.S. successfully launched its first Midas satellite into orbit on May 23, 1960. This one carried a 3,000-pound payload of technical equipment designed to detect a missile launching anywhere in the world. A few months later, the U.S. launched its Samos satellite. The Samos was specifically designed to photograph Russia and China for 300 miles out as it made an orbital journey around the Earth every 94.5 minutes. Of course, from 300 miles distance, additional photographic miracles were necessary. The Air Force revealed that the cameras on the Samos would photograph and identify any object larger than 1 square foot. The RB-47 incident. An American RB-47 reconnaissance plane disappeared over the Barents Sea on July 1, 1960. For several days, Russia pretended to be helping in the search for the missing plane and then bluntly admitted that it had been shot down. All of the crew were killed except 2. The Russians said they were holding the 2 survivors as prisoners. The United States was shocked. President Eisenhower sent Russia one of the most indignant protests of his entire career as president. Russia claimed that the plane was shot down because it had violated Russian territory just like the U-2. The United States ambassador said that this charge was an absolute falsehood. He pointed out that the plane had been under British electronic surveillance and that the United States was prepared to prove that the RB-47 had never been closer than 30 miles to the Soviet border. On July 26, 1960, the United States demanded an impartial investigation by the United Nations to fix responsibility for this inexcusable and illegal attack, which had resulted in the killing of 4 Americans and the kidnapping of 2 others. The request was referred to the Security Council. It was generally agreed that a UN investigation should be held. How else could the UN Charter be enforced unless investigations of alleged violations were conducted? But there was no investigation by the UN. Russia vetoed it. The Italian representative then moved that the International Red Cross be allowed to interview the 2 American survivors. Russia vetoed that too. Most Americans missed the ugly significance of this entire UN fiasco. Once more, Russia had violated the first 2 articles of the UN Charter and gotten away with it. There were no particular protests from the press or the public. There was no sweeping demand that Russia be expelled. There was no stirring demand that the whole UN structure be completely re-examined. Across the country, school children continued to be told that the UN was the only hope for peace and justice among men. The space race. In October 1957, Russia electrified the world with her first Sputnik. Built on plans stolen from the United States after World War II, Sputnik 1, with a payload weighing 184 pounds, was successfully launched into orbit October 4th. Immediately, the United States went into panic production to catch up. However, U.S. missile experts insisted on a broad range of experimental effort rather than single-focus crash programs such as the Russians seemed to be following. Long range, the American approach soon began to pay off. Russia continued to put up bigger payloads, but America started getting far better scientific data. Gradually, the U.S. satellite and missile teams began forging ahead. By April 1, 1960, the U.S. had the highly successful Tyros-1 in orbit, which circled the Earth every 99 minutes at a height of 450 miles. This space vehicle had solar batteries which operated Earth-controlled television cameras to transmit pictures of weather formations. This was the most successful picture-taking vehicle ever put into space. On August 11, 1960, the U.S. was the first to deorbit a satellite capsule from space. This one weighed 300 pounds. On August 12th, the U.S. put an inflated balloon into space. It was as high as a 10-story building and was described as the first radio mirror for a huge satellite communications network. 1960 also marked the launching of America's first intercontinental ballistic missiles from submerged submarines. This meant that never again could Russia plan a sneak attack on the West, because massive retaliation could be launched from America's moving missile bases at sea. Officials revealed that future satellites would carry infrared sensors capable of detecting atomic explosions and ballistic missile launchings by the communists. These also would be able to follow the trail of missiles in flight. America's long-anticipated Midas and Samos satellites ranged into orbit during 1960 and early 1961. Payload size also gradually became important to the U.S. as it neared the time when a man would be put into space. A 15-ton satellite was promised for about 1963. However, experts promised that there would be an American in space even before that. Prodded by the unknown proportions of the Russian effort, American wealth and technology poured its strength into the space race. The score by 1961 seemed significant. Space launching to date, U.S. 32, Russia 7. Still in orbit, U.S. 16, Russia 1. In solar orbit, US 2, Russia 1. Still transmitting, US 9, Russia 0. Successful moonshots, US 0, Russia 1. Recovery from orbit, US 4, Russia 1. The March of Communism in Africa. The year 1960 saw a clear manifestation that the communist timetable of conquest for Africa was right on schedule. In 1953, the communist leaders had promised themselves that during the 1960s, a wave of revolution will sweep over the whole continent of Africa, and the imperialists and colonialists will be quickly driven into the sea. They also made it clear that the agitating and provoking of the wave of revolution was the communist program for the capture of Africa. However, by 1960, the European nations with colonies in Africa were already busily trying to prepare the people for independence and self-government by peaceful means. From a communist standpoint, this would have been a defeat. Red leaders knew that any well-ordered government of natives would undoubtedly resist Russian-Chinese domination. It was therefore decided to urge the natives to demand freedom immediately before they had actually been prepared for self-government. The communists figured that in the resulting chaos, they could probably take over. This is exactly what began to take place. The tragedy in the Congo. The 1960 chain of events in the Belgian Congo illustrated the devastating effect of turning self-government over to primitive people prematurely. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the natives had already been promised independence by 1964. Consequently, their uprising was not so much for independence as for freedom now. To see the big picture, it is necessary to realize that 75 years before, when the Belgians first settled the Congo, it consisted of around 120 cannibalistic tribes living on the lowest levels of human existence. By 1960, the Belgians had created vast resources of wealth in the geographical heart of Africa. Most of it was concentrated in the province of Katanga, which produced 7.5% of the world's copper, 60% of its cobalt, most of the world's supply of radium, and large supplies of uranium and zinc. As with the French and British, the Belgians had hoped self-government could be developed among the Africans by having the natives learn technical skills and gradually assume responsibility for a stable government. Business leaders and investors were also willing to take the risk of a political transition providing the new government was well managed. In this rather cordial setting, it was agreed that the Congolese independence could be granted by 1964. The Belgians promised liberal loans to the newly planned government and also promised to keep their civil service staff working alongside the natives for several years until they could safely take over. Then, Patrice Lumumba came storming back from the Pan-African Conference chanting the current communist theme, "Independence, now, now, now." Lumumba, a former postal clerk from Stanleyville, had been trained in the special communist schools in Prague and had a brother living in Moscow. He had managed to become the head of the most left-wing political contingent in the Congo and, at the moment, enjoyed a popular following. The Belgian officials began to sense a threatening tone in his demands and saw the possibility of an Algerian type of civil war. Therefore, the government suddenly agreed to go ahead with the independence of the Congo by June 30th, 1960, instead of waiting until 1964. The Belgians thought this would satisfy Lumumba, and therefore the government was turned over to him on the prescribed date. But no sooner had Lumumba become premier than he began a volcanic tirade against the whites in general and the Belgians in particular. The whole structure of peaceful transition went out the political window overnight. The Congolese troops caught the spirit which Lumumba had exhibited and promptly mutinied against their white officers. Soon they became a roaring mob. They swept through the white sections of the principal cities, beating, robbing, and raping. As violence spread, the whites fled the Congo in terror. Some congregated temporarily in embassies, some rushed to the airports. At Leopoldville, doctors estimated that at least 1 out of every 4 women escaping to the airport had been raped, some of them a dozen times. The evacuation of the whites left the Congo almost devoid of government, schools, hospitals, or business services. The native literacy rate was one of the highest in Africa, but in all of the Congo, there was not one native engineer or doctor and only a few college graduates. To avoid total collapse and to protect the fleeing whites, the Belgian government brought in paratroopers. Lumumba, however, treated them as enemies and demanded that UN troops be flown in. No sooner had the UN forces begun to arrive than Lumumba turned against them and invited Khrushchev to send strong communist forces to take over the entire Congo. Soon, communist planes, trucks, equipment, technicians, and propagandists were arriving. Lumumba began collectivizing the land and assembling an army to drive out both the UN and the Belgian troops. He also began acting like a fully disciplined communist dictator by committing genocide against his own people. In the Kasai province, Lumumba's troops wiped out the Balubas tribe while Lumumba's cousin, Surete chief Omanombe, personally directed the massacre of the Bakwanga tribe. Rescuers were prevented from bringing out women, children, or the wounded. In spite of all this, the UN Secretariat continued to support Lumumba as the legitimate head of the government. But this was too much for the Congolese. They felt they had been betrayed. On September 5th, President Joseph Kasavubu told the world he was ousting Lumumba as premier. The very same day, Lumumba's own troops turned bitterly against him. The army chief, Joseph Mobutu, clapped the blustering Lumumba in jail and told his communist followers to get out of the Congo immediately. All of this looked like a healthy improvement to most people, but to the amazement of both Congolese and outside observers, Dag Hammarskjöld continued to use his office as UN Secretary General to intercede for Lumumba. Responsible Congolese like Premier Moise Tshombe of Katanga began asking whose side Dag Hammarskjöld was on. In the beginning, Dag Hammarskjöld's personal representative in the Congo had been Dr. Ralph Bunche, an American Negro serving as Undersecretary of the UN. But when Bunche failed in his attempt to get the Congolese to accept the communist-dominated regime of Patrice Lumumba, he was replaced. The replacement turned out to be a UN official named Rajeshwar Dayal of India. Dayal had functioned for only a short time when President Kasavubu became equally alarmed with his policies. By January 1961, Kasavubu had written 2 letters to Dag Hammarskjöld begging the UN to remove Dayal because of his strong partiality. During the latter part of 1960 and the early part of 1961, the violence of Lumumba's forces continued to spread havoc in the central and northern sections of the Congo. Press dispatches told of the raping of nuns and other atrocities against whites. Then in early February 1961, it was suddenly announced that Lumumba had escaped from Katanga and was believed to be heading back toward the central Congo to join his forces. Because Lumumba was the principal voice for both communism and violence, the premier of the Katanga province put a high price on Lumumba's head. A few days later, it was announced that Lumumba had been caught and killed by Congolese natives. Immediately, a cry of outrage came rumbling forth from Moscow, and a storm of protest emanated from the UN. President Kasavubu and Moise Tshombe could not understand why UN Secretary Dag Hammarskjöld insisted on being so sentimentally concerned over Lumumba after the terrible bloodbath he had inflicted on the Congo. The Congolese were also amazed when Hammarskjöld tried to force President Kasavubu to set up a communist coalition government. This was exactly the way each of the East European nations had been trapped into becoming Soviet satellites. Tshombe was further outraged when UN officials tried to force him to terminate all relations with the Belgians and discharge his Belgian advisors. Tshombe accused Dag Hammarskjöld of trying to drive out the Belgians so a UN power grab could be achieved. This actually took place in September 1961. Dag Hammarskjöld engineered an attack on Katanga with UN troops, which temporarily forced Tshombe from the government. Tshombe was replaced by the right-hand man of communist leader Antoine Gizenga. However, Dushanbe rallied the people under the battle cry of liberty or death, and the resistance to the UN conquest began. It was then that Dag Hammarskjöld flew to Africa to negotiate a ceasefire before the UN-sponsored regime was overthrown. En route to Katanga, the UN plane crashed and Dag Hammarskjöld was killed. In Washington, D.C., Senator Thomas A. Dodd told the U.S. Senate that Hammarskjöld's campaign had been turning the whole Congo into a communist camp. He charged that the State Department had made a monumental blunder in using American money to back the UN conquest of the Congo. During all of this excitement, many Americans thought the UN was actually trying to protect the Congo from a communist takeover. They drew this conclusion from the fact that Khrushchev had been violently criticizing Hammarskjöld's program in the Congo. Now it appeared that the fight between Khrushchev and Hammarskjöld was not on the issue of a communist takeover, since they had both been pushing for one. Their dispute was to determine who would control the communist regime once it was in power. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Communist Conquest of Cuba. Now we turn our attention to Cuba. During 1960, while the world was focusing attention on events in the Congo, a far more serious development was taking place just 90 miles from the shores of the United States. For many months, shocked Americans had been watching Fidel Castro completely destroy his pretended image as the George Washington of Cuba and triumphantly portray himself in his true role as a hardcore communist conspirator. Everything Lumumba would have done in the Congo, Castro actually accomplished in Cuba. Drumhead justice, mass executions, confiscation of industry, collectivization of the land, suspension of civil rights, suspicion of democratic processes, alliances with the Iron Curtain. All these became the trademarks of the Castro regime. To millions of Americans, this was bitterly disappointing. They had read Herbert Matthews' pro-Castro articles in the New York Times and watched prominent TV personalities portray Castro as the savior of Cuba. As a matter of research, however, there was no real excuse for missing Fidel Castro's communist connections. For years, he had been clearly identified with their leaders, their insurrections, their ideology, and their plans. And even if all of this evidence had been absent, the official records of the Havana and Bogota police departments should have told the most casual observer that Fidel Castro was certainly no pillar of hope for Cuba. Even before he graduated from law school, his checkerboard career included such crimes as assault with a deadly weapon, arson, insurrection, and murder. Who is Fidel Castro? Fidel Castro is one of 5 illegitimate children born to a servant woman on the sugar plantation of Fidel's wealthy father, Angel Castro. Biographers point out that his early upbringing was not particularly conducive to promoting the best qualities in a human personality. When Fidel was sent to secondary school, he turned out to be a mediocre student with an aggressive, ambitious, and rebellious nature. He was not well liked at the school, and to overcome his lack of popularity, he decided to impress the students by mounting a bicycle and riding it full tilt into a high stone wall. This accident left him unconscious for days. Some authorities have wondered if he ever really recovered. At 16, he obtained a gun and tried to kill a teacher because of an argument over poor grades. By the time Castro was 19, he had determined to become a lawyer. To achieve this, his father sent him to the University of Havana. Almost immediately, however, he identified himself with the most radical element on campus and joined a group of beatniks who prided themselves in being unshaven and unclean. Castro is still remembered at the University of Havana by his nickname of Bola de Chure, ball of dirty grease. Castro told Diaz-Balart, who later became his brother-in-law, that he intended to become student body president and then use his prestige to agitate the students into a revolutionary force, which would ultimately make him the political leader of Cuba. But his jealous ambition did not make him student body president. Instead, it led him to engineer his first attempt at murder in 1947. The victim was Leonel Gomez, the popular student body president of Havana High School No. 1. For political reasons, Castro shot him through the chest with intent to kill. Fortunately, the boy recovered. Castro, however, expected him to die and fled from the city to join a communist-directed expedition which was training to invade the Dominican Republic and overthrow Trujillo. Before the expedition was launched, Castro heard that Gomez had recovered and therefore felt it was safe to return to the university. Castro's second attempt at murder is successful. By 1948, Castro had gained considerable confidence in his own political prospects and was determined that nothing should stand in the way. He had made himself the head of a university terrorist organization, and on February 22, 1948, he used machine guns to kill the ex-president of the University Student Federation and a friend named Carlos Puco Samper. 2 others were wounded. Castro was arrested for this murder, but the investigation had not been thorough and he was able to get released. It is also suspected that the judge was influenced by the fact that one of Castro's Confederates was the nephew of the Cuban president. A short time after this, he left for Bogota, Colombia. Castro's student activities had brought him to the attention of Soviet agents who were looking for young firebrands to lead out in the subversion of Latin American countries. Castro was ordered to Bogota and take Rafael del Pino with him. In view of his recent brush with the law, it seemed an excellent time to be taking a trip. Castro as a Soviet agent in the Bogota riots. In April 1948, the eyes of the world were watching Bogota, Colombia, where the 9th Inter-American Conference was to be held. It was under the direction of U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall. This occasion was chosen by the Soviet strategists to stage a communist-directed insurrection. It was to unseat the conservative government of Colombia and break up the Inter-American Conference. Alberto Niño, security chief of Colombia, published a book in 1949 on the insurrection. He has much to say about Fidel Castro. Niño describes how Castro and Rafael del Pino were put under surveillance the moment they arrived at the airport. These 2 men came as replacements for 2 Russian agents stationed in Cuba, whose plans were known and who were expected by the Colombian police. Instead, these 2 came. Before the 9th of April, a telegram was taken from them announcing the arrival of one of the Russians. Niño and his men found that the planned insurrection was not being led by the Communist Party of Colombia, but by a group of international communists who worked out of the Soviet legation in Bogota. There were 9 of these international communists who fronted for the Soviet apparatus. Fidel Castro and Rafael del Pino were 2 of the 9. When the insurrection struck, it was triggered by having communist agents kill Dr. Jorge Gaitan, the most popular political leader in Colombia. Communist handbills, printed in advance, blamed the murder on the government and urged the people to avenge themselves by sacking the city. Within an hour, Bogota was converted into a holocaust of violence and flaming devastation. Niño found that the Soviet apparatus had arranged to have a crew move through the city ahead of the mob, smashing off locks and opening stores and warehouses. After the mob had looted the buildings, another crew went through spraying gasoline on floors and walls. The last stage was to have trained arsonists methodically burn these structures, which ultimately gutted the center of the city. When it was all over, the destruction of the civic center was complete. The Palace of Justice, which contained most of the civil and criminal records, was demolished to its foundations. Colleges, churches, stores, and other public buildings were burned. Altogether, 136 major buildings were destroyed, representing a loss of more than $21 million. After the battles between the police and the mobs had subsided, more than 1,000 corpses were left lying in the streets. Some of Castro's biographers have tried to gloss over Castro's complicity in this terrible destruction, but the files of the Bogota police state that detectives secured in a carnet, which the Office of Detectives now has in its possession, with a photograph of the two Cubans identifying them as first-grade agents of the Third Front of the USSR in South America. It was further discovered that Castro and Del Pino were apparently the ones assigned to arrange the murder of Jorge Gaitan. Their activities became so completely exposed that President Perez went on a nationwide broadcast to denounce the two Cubans as communist leaders in the insurrection. When it became obvious that the insurrection had failed, Castro and Del Pino left quickly for Cuba. Castro commits his third murder. Castro had barely returned, however, when he learned that Sergeant Fernandez Corral of the Havana police had been carefully investigating the machine gun murders which occurred earlier in the year and now had positive evidence that Castro was responsible. Castro immediately rounded up his associates, and when they saw an opportunity, they killed Corral on July 4, 1948. A police net was thrown out over the city. That same day, Fidel Castro was arrested and charged with the murder. But now the police had a chance to see what kind of influence Castro possessed. They soon discovered that the witnesses to the murder were so intimidated by fear of reprisal from Castro's terrorist organization that none of them would testify. Once again, the authorities were forced to release Castro, and he promptly scurried away into hiding. From this point on, Castro moved through the seething revolutionary underground of Cuba as a force to be reckoned with. By 1948, the sensational disclosures of Whittaker Chambers, Elizabeth Bentley, and a host of defected American communists had exposed Russia's worldwide conspiracy to Sovietize all humanity. As a result, a strong wave of anti-communist sentiment was rising everywhere. Up and down the Western Hemisphere, communists were being instructed to run for cover and do their work through fronts. In Cuba, Fidel Castro decided to ally himself with the Orthodox Party, which was a reform movement led by Eddie Chivas. Eddie Chivas soon detected something completely wrong with Castro and warned his associates that Castro was not only communistic but had propensities for violent revolution of the gangster variety. This warning blocked Castro from gaining further power in the leadership of the party, but he was still allowed to remain a member. The Batista regime in Cuba. By 1952, it was time for another general election, and, as usual, revolutionary activity was threatening on every hand. Candidates were being physically attacked, and some blood had been spilled. In the Cuban army, it was beginning to get around that some of the political factions were thinking of using the army to seize power and restore order. General Fulgencio Batista suddenly decided to seize Cuba's political reins and restore order himself. In order to evaluate the Batista coup, it is necessary to appreciate that never for any appreciable time since Cuba won her independence has she enjoyed genuine democracy or stable self-government. Her political history has been a tragic composite of illegal elections, assassinations, inefficiency in government, graft, nepotism, intimidation, and dictatorships. Although popular elections have been held, these have nearly always been so corruptly and fraudulently conducted that it was never certain whether the elected officials were actually the people's choice. Defeated candidates often became the leaders of revolutionary parties seeking to seize control. This would lead to dictatorial reprisal by the party in power, and thus the political pendulum would swing between the ins and the outs, with popular uprisings and military suppressions following each other in quick succession. As far as General Batista was concerned, 1952 was not the first time he had used the army to seize power and establish order in Cuba. Back in 1934, he had quelled civil strife long enough to have a new president put in office. But when the people were not satisfied with this or any other candidate for president, he finally had himself elected in 1940. A new constitution was adopted in 1940, but when the general election was held in 1944, Batista's candidate was defeated. The Batista regime was followed by two extremely corrupt, graft-ridden administrations, which once more destroyed confidence in the democratic processes. By 1952, these politicians were also destroying the stability of Cuba's economy. Batista was a candidate for president himself, but felt the elections would be a fraud and civil war would result. Therefore, he considered the circumstances sufficiently critical to justify his taking over again and reestablishing a temporary military government. There was a cry of outrage both in the United States and Cuba as Batista suspended the elections and dissolved the Congress. Nevertheless, he forged ahead with a four-pronged program. 1. Stabilizing Cuba's economy through diversified agriculture and accelerated industrial development. 2. Strengthening economic and political ties with the United States. 3. Resisting communism. And 4. Raising the Cuban standard of living. He also promised the U.S. ambassador that free elections would be held no later than 1958. By 1957, the International Money Fund ranked Cuba fourth among the 20 Latin American republics in per capita income. Although it was only 1/6 as high as the United States, it was 90% as high as Italy, far higher than Japan, and 6 times higher than India. The U.S. Department of Commerce reported, "The Cuban national income has reached levels which give the Cuban people one of the highest standards of living in Latin America." Batista's biographers agree that the general was not the usual Latin American army strongman, but was actually very pro-labor and tried to persuade the people that he wanted to carry out policies which would be popular rather than dictatorial. It soon became apparent that Batista's policies were making a highly profitable tourist mecca out of Cuba and attracting vast quantities of American capital for industrial development. It also became apparent that Cuba was gradually changing from a straitjacket sugarcane culture to a better balanced industrial agricultural tourist economy. Wages went up from 10 to 30%, and many Cuban workers were covered with health, accident, and medical insurance for the first time. Between 1950 and 1958, the overall income jumped 22%. This is after deducting 10% for rising living costs. This, then, was the promising development of Cuba which was taking place at the time Batista was overthrown. Politically, Batista's administration was typical of Cuba's past. The Batista regime indulged itself in certain quantities of graft. When there were armed insurrections, Batista met violence with violence. When there were minority uprisings, he suspended civil rights and established full military control. Nevertheless, he insisted that once conditions were stabilized, he would submit himself to the people in a popular election and would be willing to stand by the results, just as he had done in 1944. His opponents, particularly Fidel Castro, jeered at such promises and accused Batista of being opposed to constitutional government. The record shows that several times when Batista tried to slacken the reins of control, there were immediate outbursts of violence, and he would therefore tighten them again. But it was during the Castro Revolution that Batista's political sincerity was actually demonstrated. He announced that in accordance with his previous commitment, there would be a general election June 1, 1958. He invited Castro to restore peace so that the will of the people could be determined. Castro responded with a bloodthirsty manifesto in which he declared that as of April 5, 1958, any person who remained in an office of trust in the executive branch of the government would be considered guilty of treason. He said candidates for the elections must withdraw immediately or suffer 10 years imprisonment to the death sentence. He authorized his revolutionary militia in the towns and cities to shoot down candidates summarily. Responsible Cubans, such as Dr. Marquez Sterling, made contact with Castro in his mountain retreat and pleaded with the revolutionary leader to stop the bloodshed and allow the elections. Castro arrogantly turned him down. There would be no elections. During the emotional white heat of the revolution, many Americans missed the highly significant overtures which Batista was making. As it turned out, these might have made the difference in saving Cuba from the communist conquest which Castro was planning. Earlier, U.S. Ambassador Arthur Gardner had been removed because he urged support of Batista until Cuba's problems could be settled at the polls. He was replaced by Ambassador Earl Smith, who soon received a horrified State Department stare when he tried to put over the point that Castro was obviously leading Cuba and the United States into a Soviet-built communist trap. These shocked State Department experts reflected their complete disdain for their ambassador's advice by deliberately engineering a tight arms embargo against Batista. They then went further. To completely assure Batista's defeat, they promoted an agreement among the Central and South American republics that they would not sell arms to Batista either. The results were inevitable. In desperation, Batista tried to buy 15 unarmed training planes from the United States. It was finally agreed that this would be satisfactory. Batista paid for them in advance. Then Castro ordered Raúl to launch a project specifically designed to intimidate and humiliate the United States. Raúl kidnapped 30 U.S. Marines and sailors, 17 American civilians, and 3 Canadians. Threats against the lives of these hostages were used to force the United States to cancel the shipment of training planes to Batista. The experts in the State Department meekly capitulated. Some American citizens were bold enough to suggest that if Teddy Roosevelt had been alive, he would have taken the U.S. Marine Corps and landed in the middle of Castro's mountain retreat with such an earth-shaking velocity that the Cuban tyrant would have gladly released the Americans and without any price. The Castro coup d'etat. When Batista first took over in 1952, Fidel Castro had immediately projected himself into the front lines of opposition. As indicated previously, Castro had been working behind the facade of the Orthodox Party, but after the Batista coup, he insisted that this organization include the Communist Party and set up a popular front against Batista. The Orthodox Party leaders refused to do this. Castro promptly bolted the party and said he would form his own movement. It was only a short time after this, July 26, 1953, that he made his disastrous attack on the army barracks at Santiago. This turned into a real tragedy for the men in the barracks hospital who were cut to pieces by Castro's raiders, and also for Castro's men. They were met with overwhelming odds and captured or killed. Survivors were subjected to torture and eventual death in retaliation for their attack on the wards in the hospital. Thus, the 26th of July movement was born. Castro had managed to assign himself to a less dangerous post in the 26th of July attack, and when he saw the assault was failing, he fled, shouting, "Every man for himself." His brother Raúl also escaped. Later, both of the Castro brothers were captured and sentenced to prison. Fidel was sentenced to 15 years and Raúl to 13. However, both of them served only 22 months because after Batista had put down the attempted insurrection, he commuted their sentences. For this gesture of political generosity by Batista, the Castro brothers displayed only contempt. During July 1955, they left Cuba declaring that they would organize an invasion force and soon return to pull down Batista and liberate Cuba. The headquarters for this invasion movement was established near Mexico City. All kinds of people flocked there to support Castro's so-called liberation of Cuba. Some were political enemies of Batista, some were opportunists, many were sincere liberals. But just as with Lubumba in Africa, sinister hardcore communist personalities immediately moved in close to provide the guiding hand. Castro's chief of staff turned out to be Ernesto Che Guevara, an Argentinian communist assigned to work with Castro by the Soviet apparatus called Asistencia Technica. Raul Castro had received considerable training during a recent trip to Prague, Moscow, and Red China. He was therefore made commander of Castro's army. Other trained communists moved deftly into every phase of the operation. But in spite of all the training, intrigue, and planning, the famous invasion of Cuba by Castro's forces turned out to be a real fiasco. Castro's total strength was a mere handful of only 82 men who clambered aboard a leaky yacht on November 25, 1956, and set out to sea. The captain of the yacht was Hipólito Castillo, well-known strategist of the Soviet Organization for the Subversion of Latin America. The sluggish yacht was slow in reaching Cuba, and when the men waded ashore to make their heroic invasion, they were cut to pieces with gunfire. Most of them were captured or killed. Castro managed to escape into the hills and eventually work his way up into the 8,000-foot heights of the Sierra Maestra. He arrived there with only a handful of his original force. Che Guevara took over and began using propaganda and tactical strategy to dominate the immediate area and gradually rally others to the cause, especially young Cubans, full of life, ideals, and faith. Thus the strange forces of revolutionary fire began to be built, and soon civil war was reaching out across Cuba. Two major factors led to the final success of Castro's revolution. One was centered in the Soviet Union, and the other was centered in the United States. Raul Castro, who had previously been behind the Iron Curtain, made several trips to Russia and Czechoslovakia to negotiate for arms and finances. The arms arrived by submarine, the money came through by couriers. During the last months of the revolution, observers were amazed at the quantities of Czech and Russian equipment being used by the Castro forces. They were equally surprised at the vast supplies of money which Castro had available, money for wages, food, equipment, liquor, bribery, and favors. Batista, on the other hand, suddenly found himself at the other end of the horn. Because of his pro-U.S. policies, he had assumed that when the struggle for Cuba became critical, he would be able to rely on the United States to sell him arms and supplies. To his amazement, he discovered that his request for permission to buy arms in the U.S. fell on deaf ears. What he had not realized was that Herbert Matthews, Edward Murrow, Ed Sullivan, Ruby Phillips, Jules Dubois, and a multitude of other writers and opinion makers had been eulogizing Castro and castigating Batista. In Congress, Senator Wayne Morse, Representative Charles O. Porter, and Representative Adam Clayton Powell had thrown their combined weight behind the Castro cause. All this Robin Hood propaganda definitely had its effect. At the same time, Assistant Secretary of State Roy Rubottom and Caribbean Director William Wayland, the two persons who were supposed to know what was going on, blandly assured all inquirers that Fidel Castro was the hope of Cuba and had no communist taint whatever. As late as June 1959, and that was extremely late, Congressman Porter was assuring his colleagues, "No one in the State Department believes Castro is a communist or a communist sympathizer, nor does any other responsible person who wants to get his facts straight." Of course, as time marched on toward Cuba's inexorable doom, the course of history embarrassed the congressman and also the State Department. In the closing months of the conflict, American policies followed blind alleys, which authorities have since attributed to either stupidity, incompetence, or worse. The Communist Takeover. It was January 1st, 1959, that Fidel Castro became the political steward of a dazed, war-weary Cuba. Batista had fled. All opposition was crushed. In many circles of American liberals and confused newspaper readers, there was a great huzzah, as though liberty and constitutional government had come to Cuba at last. But many students of international problems saw ominous signs that the suffering and bloodletting for Cuba had barely begun. The first warnings were exultant boasts from the communist press that they had won. In Moscow, Pravda pointed out that from the very beginning of the Castro movement, our party considered it its first duty to aid the rebels, giving them the correct orientation and the support of the popular masses. The party headed the battles of the peasants for land and thereby increased its authority among the peasantry. Our party appealed to the popular masses to support Fidel Castro in every way. The Communist Party of Cuba also came out in the open to boast that they had provided an important part of the revolutionary action to overthrow the bloody tyranny of Batista, which served as the instrument of imperialistic interests and was supported by imperialism. If General Batista read this statement, he may have wondered where this imperialistic support was supposed to have come from. He knew that if the communists were accusing him of enjoying U.S. support, they were really confused. As soon as Castro took over, he used his revolutionary courts of mob justice to send over 600 persons to the firing squads. American liberals described the punishment as harsh but deserved. Then he reached out and began a reform movement of typical communist dimensions. Confiscation of land and settling Cuban workers on what turned out to be large Soviet-type collectivized farms. Confiscation of more than $1 billion worth of American industry which Castro had neither the technicians nor finances to operate. Breaking up of Cuban family life and placing medium-aged children in special farms communes so the children will be under the influence of teachers and not their families. Reorganization of the schools to serve as propaganda transmission belts to dispense communist doctrine and the hate Yankee line. Suspension of civil liberties and other constitutional guarantees. Elimination of free elections. Capture of all press, TV, and radio for government propaganda purposes. Termination of all cultural, political, and economic ties with the United States. Alliances with Russia. Recognition of Red China. Trade with the Communist bloc. While all of this communist machinery was being put into operation during 1959 and early 1960, many American apologists for Castro continued to insist that he was neither communist nor dictatorial, just misunderstood. They snatched at every hopeful atom of news from Cuba indicating that Castro might be getting more reasonable now, or Castro is changing. But all of these dreams of hopeful illusion were smashed by Castro himself when he dutifully answered the call of Nikita Khrushchev in the summer of 1960 and went to the United Nations as part of the Red Bloc show of strength. At Castro's Harlem headquarters, the two dictators warmly embraced each other. They were brothers and comrades. Now that the Iron Curtain has come rumbling down on little Cuba, perhaps some Americans occasionally reflect on the glowing description of Castro, which Herbert Matthews wrote for the New York Times in 1957. Castro, he said, has strong ideas of liberty, democracy, social justice, the need to restore the Constitution, to hold elections. Other Americans who chose the wrong side have since said, "It is also unfortunate. Perhaps it was inevitable." This last statement has a familiar ring. This is precisely the theme which Dean Acheson put in his white paper when he tried to explain why we lost China. He excused it as inevitable. But the Wedemeyer report revealed that China was also lost because of stupidity, incompetence, or worse. China was lost when the State Department promoted an arms embargo against this long-standing U.S. ally at a time when she was fighting for her very existence. The same kind of thinking put the arms embargo on Batista. Both were lost. Both were casualties of communism. All of this led former Ambassador Gardner to remark sadly, "We could have prevented it all, and we didn't. If we'd carried out normal relations with Batista, just carried out our contracts, he, Batista, would have got out as scheduled, come to live in Florida, and be replaced by an ideal candidate. A pro-Batista man? Gardner was asked. No. Marquez Sterling, a doctor whom everybody loved, was Batista's opponent. Ironically, although against Batista, he had to flee Cuba because of Castro. Events during 1961 demonstrated that the United States was still not giving the Cuban situation sufficient attention. None of the tragic blunders of the past were any worse than the fatal blunder which occurred on April 17, 1961, when an abortive invasion of Cuba was attempted at the Bay of Pigs under circumstances which doomed it to failure before the attack was even launched. Badly organized, poorly equipped, and carrying the sagging prestige of the United States with it, a little band of less than 1,400 Cubans landed from antiquated ships to spark an uprising against Castro. Castro was waiting for them with Soviet tanks, jet planes, and Soviet guns. When the shooting was over, the invaders were captured in a body. Communist propaganda machinery all over the world went into a hysteria of screaming headlines against American imperialism. A first-class disaster for U.S. prestige, wailed the Free World Press. In a panic atmosphere which followed, Castro facetiously said he might trade tractors for the prisoners. Immediately misguided U.S. liberals began collecting money for tractors to pay off Castro's blackmail demand. Castro was so pleased to see citizens from the most powerful nation in the world cowering at his feet that he gleefully tantalized the negotiators by boosting his demands. As should have been expected, the negotiations came to nothing. Responsible Americans began to demand a halt to all this ridiculous pampering of a Soviet puppet. Serious political leaders began to set down the plans for a long-range strategy which would eventually liberate the beleaguered people of Cuba. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12, Part 1 of The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Future Task. In this study, we have made no attempt to cover up the blunders of the past which free men have made in dealing with communism. In fact, all of these mistakes may be counted a benefit if we have learned a lesson from each of them. Nevertheless, we certainly would be guilty of the decadent stupidity which the communists attribute to us if we allowed ourselves to repeat these mistakes in the future. In this chapter, we shall deal with the task at hand. To appreciate the problem, we shall first discuss the progress which the communists have made under their timetable of conquest. Then we shall deal with the current line of communist strategy. Finally, we shall describe some of the most important things which must be done to win. The communist timetable of conquest. To head off an enemy, it is first necessary to know where the enemy wants to go. The communists have made no secret about this. Their plan, first of all, is to take Asia, then Africa, next Europe, and finally America. Although this plan of conquest has been in communist literature for several decades, it was vigorously restated in 1953 when Red leaders decided to set up a timetable of conquest for the entire world and then take it continent by continent. Total conquest is to be completed by around 1973. Fortunately, American military intelligence captured this timetable at the close of the Korean War, and Senator William Noland placed it in the Congressional Record under the date of April 29, 1954, page 5708. Although the timetable is too lengthy to quote in its entirety, selected statements are being presented with comments so the student may know what progress the communists have made in their plans to take over the world. We have to, until we are certain of victory, take a course which will not lead to war. Official communist strategy is to press for advantages on all fronts, but to back down in the face of major military resistance. This will continue to be their policy unless they could be certain of sudden victory by a sneak attack, which would wipe out all U.S. capacity to retaliate. U.S. success during 1960 in launching a Polaris missile from a submerged submarine made Soviet sneak attack plans obsolete. A red attack would bring devastating retaliation from these constantly moving missile bases, which will now be roaming the seas. For the present, red policy will therefore have to be a course which will not lead to war. Britain must be placated by being convinced that the communists and the capitalist countries can live in peace. Peaceful coexistence was not only sold to the people of Britain but to Americans as well. Coexistence means to accept communism as a permanent fixture in the earth, to write off as past history the conquest of the satellite nations, to placate communist demands so as to avoid crises and international tensions. Opportunities for trade will have a great influence on the British mind. This worked even better than the Red leaders planned. Today, not only Britain, but the U.S. and 37 other members of the Western Bloc have succumbed to the lure of trade with the Sino-Soviet bloc. In the case of France, she must be made to feel a sense of greater security in cooperating with us. After World War II, Red forces in France made the Communist Party the largest in the country. Before de Gaulle's seizure of power in 1958, Red influence had helped to carry France to the brink of bankruptcy, anarchy, and civil war. Japan must be convinced that rearmament endangers her national security and that the American forces distributed all over the world cannot spare sufficient strength for the defense of Japan. This was the kind of communist agitation which produced the 1960 Japanese riots and prevented President Eisenhower from visiting Japan. Japan's desire for trade will offer great possibilities for steering Japan away from the United States. By 1960, Japan had regained her position as fifth in world trade. The U.S. steered Japan away from the Sino-Soviet bloc by buying 23% of her exports and providing 34.8% of her imports. By 1960, China's military, economic, and industrial power will be so developed that with a mere show of force by the Soviet Union and China, the ruling clique of Japan will capitulate. This did not occur. Japan, with U.S. help, became strong while China floundered under communist discipline and headed for widespread famine and economic collapse. The United States must be isolated by all possible means. This communist project was making alarming progress by 1960. Anti-U.S. propaganda all over the world had created the image of the ugly American, and this in spite of $50 billion in foreign aid. Red expansion in Asia, Africa, Cuba, Central America, and South America has begun to awaken Americans to the real threat of possible isolation. Whether we can prevent the United States from starting the war to defend her rights and liberties depends upon how much success we have in isolating her and how effective is our peace offensive. This clearly reflects the perfidy of Red propaganda to use peace as a means of paralyzing U.S. resistance as the communists gradually take over. Here we see the Red definition of peaceful coexistence. It means peaceful surrender. In the case of India, only peaceful means should be adopted. Any employment of force will alienate ourselves from the Arabic countries and Africa because India is considered to be our friend. This plan to betray India through peaceful conquest is definitely on the march. Nehru claims neutrality, but is a trained Marxist socialist who has consistently lined up with the Red leaders on most major issues. In the hour of his downfall, he will no doubt ask the Western nations to save him. After India has been won over, the problems of the Philippines and Arabic countries can be easily solved by economic cooperation and coalitions. This task may be completed by 1965. Already, the forces of red subversion are clearly apparent in both the Philippines and in Nasser's Pan-Arabic Republic. Then a wave of revolution will sweep the whole continent of Africa, and the imperialists and the colonialists will be quickly driven into the sea. Even by 1960, the communists had built the fires of revolutionary violence all over Africa. The colonial powers were trying to get the natives to follow a policy of peaceful transition to independence, but many of them were following the red formula, from colonialism to chaos to communism. With Asia and Africa disconnected with the capitalist countries in Europe, there will be a total economic collapse in Western Europe. Their capitulation will be a matter of course. In 1960, when the Belgians relinquished the Congo, it created havoc in the Belgian economy. Each of the colonial powers is being affected as the trade relations with Africa are being disrupted. Eventually, the Reds hope to get an African-Asian stranglehold on the economy of Europe. Every year, this noose is drawn tighter. As for the United States, crushing economic collapse and industrial breakdown will follow the European crisis. The plunging of the U.S. into a paralyzing depression is part of the last-stage Soviet plan of conquest for America. Canada and South America will find themselves in the same hopeless and defenseless condition. It is true that if the U.S. were totally isolated, intimidated, and subverted, the whole Western Hemisphere would fall. 20 years from now, which would be 1973, world revolution will be an accomplished fact. Some phases of this plan of conquest have been frustrated, but other phases are far ahead of expectations. Considered overall, the communist timetable of conquest is alarmingly close to being right on schedule. Experts on communist strategy point out that this entire plan of conquest would collapse if the West awakened and took the initiative to start pushing communism back on all fronts. They say the tragic blunder of the West has been its continuous willingness to coexist, to accept communism as a permanent fixture in the earth, to assume that communist conquests were unalterable, to ignore the fact that the Red leaders have admitted in the timetable that they have more reason to be frightened of military action than the West, and to allow free nations to be intimidated and bluffed into appeasing a weak enemy. How was this achieved? Importance of the psychological war. The biggest mistake of the West has been allowing itself to drift into a state of mental stagnation, apathy, and inaction. In some circles, motivations of patriotism, loyalty, and the traditional dream of freedom for all men have been lying dormant or have been paralyzed by a new kind of strange thinking. Authorities say there is an urgent need for a revolutionary change in our state of mind. What is wrong with our state of mind? First and foremost, we have been thinking the way the communists want us to think. Our founding fathers would be alarmed to learn how confused many of our people have become over such fundamental problems as coexistence, disarmament, free trade, the United Nations, recognition of Red China, and a host of related problems. Instead of maintaining a state of intellectual vigilance, we have taken communist slogans as the major premises for too many of our conclusions. Let us go down a list of current strategy goals which the communists and their fellow travelers are seeking to achieve. These are all part of the campaign to soften America for the final takeover. It should be kept in mind that many loyal Americans are working for these same objectives because they are not aware that these objectives are designed to destroy us. Current communist goals. 1. U.S. acceptance of coexistence as the only alternative to atomic war. 2. U.S. willingness to capitulate in preference to engaging in atomic war. 3. Develop the illusion that total disarmament by the United States would be a demonstration of moral strength. 4. Permit free trade between all nations regardless of communist affiliation and regardless of whether or not items could be used for war. 5. Extension of long-term loans to Russia and Soviet satellites. 6. Provide American aid to all nations regardless of communist domination. 7. Grant recognition of Red China. Admission of Red China to the UN. 8. Set up East and West Germany as separate states in spite of Khrushchev's promise in 1955 to settle the Germany question by free elections under supervision of the UN. 9. Prolong the conferences to ban atomic tests because the U.S. has agreed to suspend tests as long as negotiations are in progress. 10. Allow all Soviet satellites individual representation in the UN. 11. Promote the UN as the only hope for mankind. If its charter is rewritten, demand that it be set up as a one-world government with its own independent armed forces. Some communist leaders believe the world can be taken over as easily by the UN as by Moscow. Sometimes these two centers compete with each other, as they are now doing in the Congo. 12. Resist any attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. 13. Do away with all loyalty oaths. 14. Continue giving Russia access to the U.S. Patent Office. 15. Capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. 16. Use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. 17. Get control of the schools. Use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum. Get control of teachers' associations. Put the party line in textbooks. 18. Gain control of all student newspapers. 19. Use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organizations which are under communist attack. 20. Infiltrate the press. Get control of book review assignments, editorial writing, policy-making positions. 21. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. 22. Continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. An American communist cell was told to eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings, substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. 23. Control art critics and directors of art museums. Our plan is to promote ugliness, repulsive, meaningless art. 24. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press. 25. Break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. 26. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, healthy. 27. Infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. Discredit the Bible and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch. 28. Eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools on the ground that it violates the principle of separation of church and state. 29. discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned, out of step with modern needs, a hindrance to cooperation between nations on a worldwide basis. 30. Discredit the American Founding Fathers. Present them as selfish aristocrats who had no concern for the common man. 31. Belittle all forms of American culture and discourage the teaching of American history on the ground that it was only a minor part of the big picture. Give more emphasis to Russian history since the communists took over. 32. Support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. 33. Eliminate all laws or procedures which interfere with the operation of the communist apparatus. 34. Eliminate the House Committee on Un-American Activities. 35. Discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI. 36. Infiltrate and gain control of more unions. 37. Infiltrate and gain control of big business. 38. Transfer some of the powers of arrest from the police to social agencies. Treat all behavioral problems as psychiatric disorders which no one but psychiatrists can understand or treat. 39. Dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who opposed communist goals. 40. Discredit the family as an institution. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. 41. Emphasize the need to raise children away from the negative influence of parents. Attribute prejudices, mental blocks, and retarding of children to suppressive influence of parents. 42. Create the impression that violence and insurrection are legitimate aspects of the American tradition, that students and special interest groups should rise up and use united force to solve economic, political, or social problems. 43. Overthrow all colonial governments before native populations are ready for self-government. 44. Internationalize the Panama Canal. 45. Repeal the Connolly Reservation so the U.S. cannot prevent the World Court from seizing jurisdiction over domestic problems. Give the World Court jurisdiction over nations and individuals alike. If the student will read the reports of congressional hearings together with available books by ex-communists, he will find all of these communist objectives described in detail. Furthermore, he will come to understand how many well-meaning citizens have become involved in pushing forward the communist program without realizing it. They became converted to communist objectives because they accepted superficial communist slogans. Soon they were thinking precisely the way the communists wanted them to think. Let us examine some of these problems at closer range. What about disarmament? The communists have created the illusion in free men's minds that the way to peace is through disarmament. We must not forget that this originated as a communist slogan. Now free men have adopted it as their own and are even setting up special commissions to explore ways and means to carry it out. In this action, we are deliberately closing our eyes to everything we promised ourselves at the close of World War II and again at the end of the Korean War. Experts tell us that to disarm in the face of an obvious and present danger is an immoral act. It is an act of self-destruction. Here are just a few fundamental facts on disarmament which the experts who know communism are pleading with us to consider. Disarmament means to depend upon agreements instead of strength. Agreements are absolutely useless unless they can be enforced. The fallacy of a disarmament agreement with Russia, a nation which has violated 51 out of 53 agreements already, is this. If Russia chose to secretly rearm, we would have lost our capacity to enforce the agreement. Such an agreement gives a dishonest party a devastating advantage because of his capacity to arm secretly. In a vacuum of disarmament, a government with criminal intentions requires very few secret arms to overcome all opposition. This is what Hitler and Mussolini taught us. On February 3, 1961, Dr. Arnold Wolfers told the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, "A few easily concealed or clandestinely manufactured weapons would, in a totally disarmed world, give one nation decisive military power over others. A totally disarmed world is also one in which communist characteristics of secrecy and of a society organized along military lines would give them maximum advantage." But in all this talk about disarmament, the thing to remember is that Khrushchev would not dare disarm. His armed forces of 6 million, including 2 million secret police, are not to fight the West, but to maintain domestic tranquility behind the Iron Curtain. They are to suppress uprisings which have occurred in the satellites and in Russia. Furthermore, Khrushchev is continually haunted by the specter of the Red Chinese, who would like nothing better than to see the Russians disarm. So we repeat, Khrushchev would not dare disarm. Finally, in answer to those who claim that an arms race will lead to war, let us point out the rather obvious fact that an arms race is not an underlying cause of war, but a symptom of political conflict. To disarm in the face of political conflict invites war. The United States was well on the way to disarming and demobilizing when the Korean War jolted us into the realization that vicious forces of conquest were still stalking up and down the earth. Because that predatory force has not relented, we have to stay armed. In view of all these facts, it should be clear to anyone that the cry for disarmament is not the message of peace and freedom. It is the message of the enemy. What about peaceful coexistence? The communists have created another illusion with reference to peaceful coexistence. This is the idea that the West must be willing to coexist with communism, since the only alternative would be annihilation through atomic war. The real alternative to coexistence is co-resistance. Experts in the field have been saying for years that communism does not have to be tolerated. It has no moral, economic, or political excuse for existing. Furthermore, it is extremely vulnerable to many types of peaceful pressures which free men have not yet used. We will discuss these in a later section. At this point, it is important simply to emphasize that communism can be beaten, and it can be done without atomic war. Therefore, the whole basis for arguing coexistence collapses. Coexistence is a contradiction of terms because it means trying to coexist with world conquest, which is impossible. One must resist or be conquered. It also means accepting the status quo of 1/3 of the human race in bondage as a permanent working arrangement. It means accepting communism in spite of its deceit, subversion, and broken covenants. It means tolerating communism without resistance. The United States Congress was right when it proclaimed in its Captive Nations Resolution of July 1959, "The enslavement of a substantial part of the world's population by communist imperialism makes a mockery of the idea of peaceful coexistence." And the President sounded a note of awakening resistance when he said, "It is appropriate and proper to manifest to the peoples of the captive nations the support of the government and the people of the United States of America for their just aspirations for freedom and national independence." What about the United Nations? All over the world, people demand that some type of international arena be created where disputes between nations can be arbitrated or settled without resorting to war. Two attempts have been made to create such an arena: the League of Nations and the United Nations. Both ran into difficulty, and for the same reason. Both organizations started out as exclusive federations of peace-loving nations and then turned right around and tried to convert themselves into world parliaments where all nations could be represented, including warlike or predatory nations. In both cases, the predatory nations successfully seized power and almost completely nullified all the high-sounding phrases contained in their original statements of purpose. As far as the United Nations is concerned, this weakness was emphasized by John Foster Dulles when he addressed the American Bar Association. He said the failures of the UN are due primarily to the fact that its effective functioning depends upon cooperation with a nation which is dominated by an international party seeking world domination. Henry Cabot Lodge pointed out the same thing. In 1945 and 1946, the United States assumed that Russia was a peace-loving nation, and the whole United Nations was based on the assumption that the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union would continue, which of course was a very false, tragically false assumption. There are numerous provisions in the UN Charter which permit predatory powers such as the USSR or her satellites to bring the orderly processes of the UN to a dead halt. In the UN's 15 years of existence, the USSR has used this organization for subversion behind the scenes and legal sabotage in her open councils. This has not only frustrated the peace-preserving powers of the UN, but has almost completely paralyzed individual action by the other members because they have committed themselves to rely on the UN to settle disputes. When one reflects upon the Soviet veto of the UN attempt to censure Russia following her invasion of Hungary and her veto of the UN attempt to have an investigation of the killing of 4 Americans on the RB-47 in 1960, it emphasizes the long list of atrocities which Soviet leaders have committed without punishment or censure, even though every one of them violated Article 2 of the UN Charter. Consider these provisions. 1. The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all members. 2. All members shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present charter. 3. All members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means. 4. All members shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. 5. All members shall refrain from giving assistance to any state against which the United Nations is taking preventative or enforcement action. In Hungary, China, Southeast Asia, Cuba, Africa, Central and South America, Korea, one might say in every sector of the world, the USSR has violated these principles continually. As a result of this vast contradiction between promise and performance, the whole UN complex is gradually reaching an impasse or stalemate. What then can be done with red aggression, with its worldwide program of insurrection, riots, civil war, and conquest? And what should be done with the UN? Because the United States is the most wealthy and powerful nation in the world, she is expected to provide an answer. And because practically every other imaginable suggestion has been presented, it is time to come up with the simple, direct answer which we should have adopted long ago. Turn back to the original intent of the Charter. Restrict UN membership to peace-loving nations. This is precisely what Article 4 provides, and it has been the violation of this article which has produced most of the trouble. Because we have waited so long to eliminate the warlike nations, this change will involve some difficulties. But this would be nothing compared to the difficulties which lie ahead if free men pursue their present course. Due to the veto technicalities and numerous violations of American constitutional law in the existing charter, it would be necessary to reconstruct the entire framework of the UN. Nevertheless, it could be done. No doubt some would object to the elimination of Russia and her satellites from the UN on the ground that it would prevent the UN from serving as a world parliament. The answer to that objection is the proven fact that the UN can never serve peace-loving peoples as long as the UN tries to accommodate its forum to the harassment and bedevilment of nations who make no pretense at fulfilling their obligations either under the Charter or under international law. What if the Founding Fathers of the United States had tried to include King George in the Constitutional Convention? The results would have been as frustrating and aggravating as they have turned out to be with a predatory nation and her satellites sitting in the UN Assembly of Peace-Loving Nations. The Founding Fathers would no doubt look at our present UN operation and say, "It is illogical, it is illegal, it is impossible." 15 years of UN history painfully prove it. But would not such action drive Russia and her satellites into a second association of red nations and create a contest of power blocks? This already exists. The only difference would be that the red bloc would not be in the UN to sabotage the united desires of the peace-loving nations as it does today. Would not such action provoke war? Not as long as the West remains strong. It would not weaken the West's military position at all. If anything, such action would strengthen it. It would also create the necessary federation of strength to start putting economic and political pressures on communism and thereby allow her enslaved peoples to strike from within and eventually destroy this specter of human tyranny. This new arrangement would give us the ideal vehicle to begin implementing all the fine promises we made in the Captive Nations Proclamation on July 1959. Is there no other way? Apparently not. All other approaches turn out to be diversionary. They merely postpone the day of honest decision. If free men united to bring about this needed change, the new Federation of Peace-Loving Nations could perform a political miracle, one which would give new assurance for both peace and prosperity. We have a task to perform, and time is running out. Is the communist movement a legitimate political party? This question grows out of another illusion which the communists created in our minds. They induced us to accept the idea that communism is a legitimate expression of political action. The truth is that communism is a criminal conspiracy. It is a mistake to treat it as a political party. Political groups solve their problems by entering into negotiations, attending conferences, and working out their differences with bona fide compromises, which all parties are expected to perform. This has never worked with the communists because they use deceit, disregard of laws, violation of treaties, intimidation, subversion, and open insurrection as basic tools of conquest. This makes it a criminal conspiracy. Once we realize that communism is a criminal operation, many new avenues of action open before us. For example, a criminal problem is not handled by negotiation and compromise, but by following 4 steps. 1. Immobilize the criminal. 2. Render him harmless. 3. Gain his confidence. 4. Rehabilitate him. It may be recalled that these are the 4 steps which were used in dealing with both Germany and Japan when their leaders pursued the criminal course of action which precipitated World War II. The Western Allies followed these steps, and Germany and Japan were not only immobilized and rendered harmless, but they were successfully rehabilitated. After the war, West Germany and Japan became 2 of America's closest supporters. Does this mean a preventative war should be waged against the criminal communists? Not at all. It means that while there is still time and before a major shooting war is necessary, Free men should utilize available peaceful measures to immobilize the Soviet Empire and work for the day when her own people can overthrow the tyrannical rule of red leaders from within. What peaceful pressures are available? We have already mentioned the importance of taking away the illegal membership which the USSR and her satellites hold in the UN. Another highly potent weapon is available which would cut off communist and espionage machinery. This is the peaceful weapon of severing diplomatic relations. It is the action Thomas Jefferson recommended for nations which treat us atrociously. He said, "I am anxious that we should give the world still another lesson by showing them other modes of punishing injuries than by war. I love, therefore, the proposition of cutting off all communications with the nation which has conducted itself so atrociously." Recently, Senator Barry Goldwater and other students of the problem have advocated this very type of action against the Soviet Empire. There are plenty of reasons to justify it. Russia is guilty of continuous violations of treaties and covenants, repeated violations of international law, vicious subversion and interference in the domestic affairs of other nations, open warfare against peace-loving peoples, provocative acts with the leveling of insults and false charges against the United States, illegal killing of American servicemen, illegal shooting down of American planes, illegal imprisonment of American citizens. The lack of political courage to sever diplomatic relations with Russia is often covered up with the plea that we might lose some important advantages by isolating Russia in this manner. What advantages? Senator Goldwater has pointed out that there are none. Since the United States recognized the USSR in 1933, not one single advantage has accrued to the United States which could not have been achieved equally well, and often far more easily, without recognition. Recognition turned out to be a tool of conquest for the communists. In addition to isolating communism internationally, it also needs to be outlawed domestically. This is so important that Lenin said the communists must do everything possible to avoid it. Whittaker Chambers summarized this point when he said, "Lenin had tirelessly taught that when a whole communist party is outlawed, it is almost wholly paralyzed because it can no longer send into the surrounding community the filaments whereby it spreads its toxins from which it draws its strength of life." But would not a statute outlawing the Communist Party threaten legitimate political parties? Not if the statute were aimed at any organization advocating the overthrow of the government by force and violence. Criminal law strikes at illegal acts or any conspiracy to commit illegal acts. A conspiracy to overthrow the government by force and violence is therefore criminal in nature. Any organization which promotes such illegal activities should be outlawed. As a number of authorities have already pointed out, it is foolish to treat the communists as a legitimate political party, as it would be to give bank robbers business licenses. Is the Soviet Empire vulnerable to economic pressure? Probably the greatest single weakness of the Sino-Soviet bloc is her shaky economy. Here is a soft spot where peaceful pressures could be devastating. No amount of Soviet propaganda can cover up the obvious collapse of the Chinese communes and the sluggish inefficiency of the Soviet collectivized farms. Every single Soviet satellite is languishing in a depression. Even Pravda has openly criticized the lack of bare essentials and the shoddy quality of Russian-made goods. These factors of austerity and deprivation add to the hatred and misery of the people which constantly feed the flames of potential revolt. Terrorist tactics have been used by the Red leaders to suppress uprisings. In spite of the virtual state of siege which exists throughout the Soviet Empire, there are many outbreaks of violent protest. All of this explains why the Soviet leaders are constantly pleading for free trade, long-term loans, increased availability of material goods from the West. Economically, communism is collapsing, but the West has not had the good sense to exploit it. Instead, the United States, Great Britain, and 37 other Western powers are shipping vast quantities of goods to the Sino-Soviet bloc. Some business leaders have had the temerity to suggest that trade with the Reds helps the cause of peace. They suggest that you never fight the people you trade with. Apparently, they cannot even remember as far back as the late 30s when this exact type of thinking resulted in the sale of scrap iron and oil to the Japanese just before World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, it became tragically clear that while trade with friends may promote peace, trade with a threatening enemy is an act of self-destruction. Have we forgotten that fatal lesson so soon? Could peaceful pressures cause the communist empire to explode internally? The communist leaders have always been extremely sensitive to their own internal weaknesses. They frequently resort to capital punishment to suppress the bitter criticism of their own enslaved people. They use propaganda to boast of pretended successes in the very areas where they suffer the greatest failures. A close scrutiny of recent history will demonstrate that time and time again free men could have tied the communist conspiracy in knots if only they had been watching for opportunities to exploit fuming internal pressures which were ready to explode. Many of these pressures are building today. Each one of them represents a golden opportunity for direct action by the Free West. But free men must first make up their minds whether they really want freedom for the Iron Curtain captives. Is it worth giving up a little trade? Is it worth the temporary political heat of a showdown in the UN? Is it worth the momentary clamor which Red agents would foment if we withdrew diplomatic recognition? It is extremely confusing to freedom fighters, especially in the satellites, when they watch the failing communist economy being bolstered and fed by 39 Western nations. In the UN, the distortion of justice and common sense bewilders them. In diplomatic circles, the constant capitulation and compromise outrages them. A refugee from a Russian slave labor camp wrote to me, "There must be a noose of ignorance around the necks of the West. Don't they know we would eventually overthrow the communist leaders if the West would just stop feeding, fondling, and coddling them?" In the minds of these people, it borders on criminal negligence when we withhold the impact of powerful peaceful pressures which are available to us. During World War II, we promised freedom to all of these satellite peoples, and we should never let the communists forget that Stalin promised them freedom. In his order of the day, number 130, dated May 1st, 1942, Joseph Stalin declared, "It is not our aim to seize foreign lands or to subjugate foreign people. We have not and cannot have such war aims as the imposition of our will and regime on the Slavs and other enslaved peoples of Europe who are waiting our aid. Our aim consists in assisting these people in their struggle for liberation from Hitler's tyranny and then setting them free to rule in their own lands as they desire." Neither should the West allow Nikita Khrushchev to forget what he has said. The Soviet Union deeply sympathizes with all the nations striving to win and uphold their independence, and these nations can rest assured that the Soviet Union, without any meddling in their internal affairs, without stipulating any conditions, will help them to strengthen their independence for which they fought so hard. The unbelievable bald-faced deception of such statements should motivate free nations in their firm resolve to strike back at communism on every front. Too often, the Western apologists for coexistence and peace at any price are panicked when it is suggested that economic and political pressures be applied in order to squeeze the Soviet Empire into an internal explosion. They wail that such an action will disturb the peace behind the Iron Curtain, and indeed it would. In fact, it should be a standard object of strategy to disturb the peace of the Red leaders. This was precisely what President Woodrow Wilson was talking about when he said, "I will not take any part in composing difficulties that ought not to be composed, and a difficulty between an enslaved people and its autocratic rulers ought not to be composed. We in America have stood from the day of our birth for the emancipation of people throughout the world who are living unwillingly under governments which were not of their choice. So long as wrongs like that exist in the world, you cannot bring permanent peace to the world. I go further than that. So long as wrongs of that sort exist, you ought not to bring permanent peace to the world, because those wrongs ought to be righted, and enslaved peoples ought to be free to right them." Just the moment the Western powers developed the courage to clamp a total trade embargo on the communist empire and then combine it with a policy of go home and take your spies with you, the hearts of Iron Curtain freedom fighters can once more surge with hope. Not until then will America's eloquent captive nations proclamation mean anything. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Chapter 12, Part 2 of The Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Future Task, Part 2. What can the ordinary individual do? The war between freedom and slavery is not just a fight to be waged by congressmen, the president, soldiers, and diplomats. Fighting communism, socialism, and the subversion of constitutional government is everybody's job, and working for the expansion of freedom is everybody's job. It is a basic American principle that each individual knows better than anyone else what he can do to help once he has become informed. No citizen will have to go far from his own home to find a faltering battle line which needs his aid. Communist influences are gnawing away everywhere, and thousands of confused citizens often aid and abet them by operating in a vacuum of their own ignorance. The task is therefore to become informed and then move out for action. Just to stimulate a little positive thinking, here are a few elementary suggestions for different types of individuals. Suggestions for parents. 1. Stay close to your children to make sure they are being trained to think like Washington and Lincoln, not like Marx and Lenin. 2. In providing physical needs for your family, don't forget their spiritual needs. We are in an ideological war. From a Marxist viewpoint, an atheistic mind is already 3/4 conquered. 3. Take your children to church. Don't send them. Be sure they are getting true religious values, not modernistic debunking. 4. Help your children grow up. Don't fall for the current socialist communist line that parents are a detriment to their children. They are only a detriment when they don't do their job. 5. Children require a formula of 90% love and 10% discipline. 6. Do not fall for the permissive school of psychology which says discipline will harm human development. Such thinking produces hoodlums with maladjusted personalities who are likely to fall for every ism that comes along. A child needs to know that he lives in an orderly world. Discipline is part of it, not extreme harshness, but a reasonable and consistent enforcement of the rules. 7. Because youth problems happen to be one of my own areas of professional study, I wrote a book designed to answer the communist and socialist charge that modern parents cannot do a good job of raising children. 8. Be active in PTA. If you are not, communists and centralized planners will take over. 9. Have a freedom library in your home. Include good biographies of the Founding Fathers. 10. Take a little time each day to keep up with political problems at home and abroad. 11. Subscribe to a good news magazine such as U.S. News and World Report. 12. Where you have older children, Make current events part of the dinner table talk. Be quick to point out left-wing slanting of news, TV, or radio broadcasts. There is far more of this slanting than most people realize. 13. Organize a family, a neighborhood, or church study group. Help your family realize that there is a great struggle going on in the world which they can help to win. 14. Let your children see that you are interested in civic affairs, that you participate in political affairs, that you are concerned with what is going on. They borrow many of their own attitudes from you. Suggestions for teachers. 1. The most important single force in winning against communism is in the field of education. Therefore, you are in the front-line trenches. 2. Be certain you have taken time to get a good background on communistic thought so you can detect it quickly wherever it appears. 3. Define for students the difference between the factors which made Americans the first free people in modern times and the principles which have destroyed freedom whenever the socialists and communists have taken over. 4. Help the students understand that free enterprise has produced and distributed more material wealth than any other system man has yet discovered. Point out that it also permits most of our citizens to make a living doing the things they enjoy. At least they can change jobs if they don't like what they are doing. It is also vital for students to appreciate that the remaining weaknesses in our system are important, but they are minute compared to the monumental problems of the bare subsistence economies under socialism and communism. 5. Beware of those who come pretending to help education when they are trying to seize control of education. Socialist and communist planners have ambitions to eliminate all local control, which means the teachers themselves would lose control. 6. Be alert to the fact that education was infiltrated by the socialist-communist contingent over 35 years ago. Many of them were top echelon personalities who worked their way into leading educational organizations. Because they were hard workers, they gained sweeping control of some of our most respected institutions. 7. Read Education for One Socialist World, which is Chapter 8 in the UN Record by Chesley Manley. Henry Regnery Company, Chicago, 1955. On page 175, Mr. Manley lists a number of books which every teacher should read in order to be aware of the attack against American education during the past 4 decades. 8. In addition, you will find the following books helpful. Conquest of the American Mind by Dr. Felix Whitmer, Meader Publishing Company, Boston. What's Happened to Our Schools? By Rosalie M. Gordon, a pamphlet published by America's Future Incorporated, New Rochelle, New York. The Turning of the Tides by Paul W. Schaefer and John Howland Snow, Longhouse Publishers. Progressive Education is Redication by Jones and Olivier, Meader Publishing Company, Boston. Brainwashing in the High Schools by Dr. E. Merrill Root, Devon Adair, New York. Communist Socialist Propaganda in American Schools by Vern P. Kaub, published by Lakeshore Press, Madison, Wisconsin. 9. If any of the educational organizations to which you belong are socialist-oriented, try to recapture them. Do not try to do it alone. Gather a group of alerted teachers around you and move forward as an organized group. 10. Encourage the teaching of communist problems in the school. Such a course can become an excellent vehicle to teach American students how to appreciate their own way of life. The name of the course is important. Communist problems is likely to be more acceptable than teaching communism. 11. Watch for slanted passages in textbooks. Socialist authors have invaded the textbook field. So have some with even more radical views. Brainwashing in the High Schools by E. Merrill Root is an analysis of 11 American history books which reflect the destructive left-wing line. 12. Don't be misled by the current atheistic drive to take God out of the classroom. Separation of church and state was to keep creeds out of the curriculum, but not God. It would be as unconstitutional to teach irreligion in the classroom as it would be to emphasize some particular religion. As teachers, we are not to teach a particular faith, but parents are within their rights when they insist that the classroom is not be used by those few teachers who seek to destroy faith. Teachers who believe that teaching atheism is a necessary part of a good education are not really qualified to teach in a Judaic-Christian culture. They are entitled to be atheists, but as public employees, they are not entitled to teach it. If they do, they are violating an important constitutional principle. 13. Encourage patriotic speakers at school assemblies. Excellent films are also available. Many organizations now have well-informed speakers who can give impressive talks on subjects which arouse excellent student response. 14. When a Freedom Forum is held in your area, try to attend. Suggestions for students. 1. The mind of the student is considered a major battlefield by communist strategists. The communist conquest of a country is always preceded by the extensive activities of converted intellectuals. However, the most vigorous antagonists of communism are some of these same intellectuals who have been disillusioned and returned to the side of freedom. 2. You will never have more time to study communism than while you are in school. Try to get a genuine understanding of it. Learn its philosophy, its history, and its fallacies. 3. When you run across dedicated socialists, remember that the only difference between a socialist and a communist is in the method of takeover. The desire to seize monolithic control of society is the same for both. Sometimes people forget that USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Some people count socialism good and communism bad. In reality, the two are twins. 4. Be quick to detect left-wing slanting in textbooks and lectures. 5. Become acquainted with the latest communist line. Work up answers to their charges and proposals. 6. Be sure to remain fair and forthright. Never stoop to communist tactics to win a point. 7. You can enjoy school far more when your education becomes purposeful. Get acquainted with the communist problems, and it will suddenly make economics, history, philosophy, political science, sociology, and psychology come alive. These are all related to the war for survival in which we are now engaged. 8. Be conscious of the fact that people look at world events through one of two windows. Out of one window, the students, and sometimes the professor, see only blue skies. Out of the other window, the student can see storm clouds. This is the window to watch. This is where history is being made, and the person who doesn't keep his eye on this window is caught unawares when the storm breaks. On the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, most Americans had to move from window number 1 to window number 2 with great speed. They came close to being too late. Damage from the world's threatening political storms can be avoided only by anticipating them, by being vigilant and alert. 9. If you have difficulty in philosophy and your mind is plagued with doubts, read the experience of a student described in the last chapter of this book. 10. Resist the radical element on campus who advocate mass action and violent demonstrations. These are usually the tools of communist agitators. They get students to demonstrate, and this usually provokes a fight. When the police try to restore order, the communists slip away in an effort to let the students take the blame. When communist agitators got the students to wreck the congressional hearings at San Francisco during May of 1960, the judge decided to release them because he felt the students could already see how they had been duped into fronting for professional anti-Americans. 11. Organize a student group to study communism and Americanism. Challenge socialists and pro-communists on the campus. Publish a paper. Set up a speakers bureau. Write letters to your school paper. Get experience in making peaceful democratic processes work. 12. A rapidly growing student organization with a patriotic purpose is the Torchbearers. Suggestions on how to set up a school chapter may be obtained by writing to the Torchbearers, 5354 West 126th Street, Hawthorne, California. Suggestions for businessmen. 1. Remember that Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Madison, Adams, and the rest of the founding fathers were not colonial aristocrats, as some textbooks proclaim, but were just successful businessmen. Because they were willing to sit down and think through the problems of their day, we inherited a free nation. 2. Take time from the pressures of a business to stay informed. Subscribe to a good news magazine such as U.S. News and World Report. 3. Become a member of an organization which will send you frequent intelligence reports on current problems. One of the most effective private agencies in this field is the American Security Council, 205 West Monroe Street, Chicago, Illinois. 4. Take an active part in the political party of your choice. Watch for the strong socialist influence which is trying to take over both parties. Do not hesitate to throw your financial strength and your time behind the fight for freedom. It cost Washington $65,000 to leave his business and serve in the Revolutionary Army. In current inflated money values, this would represent nearly $500,000. 5. If you belong to a service club, get it in the fight for freedom. Most civic clubs have a special committee to inspire patriotic interests. Invite speakers to keep the business community alert. 6. Sponsor essay and speech contests in the schools to promote American ideals and resistance to deceptive communist propaganda. 7. Openly resist the sale of goods to the Soviet Empire and call for a total embargo against the USSR and her satellites. 8. Work for a more equitable tax structure which is not arbitrary and confiscatory. Economic freedom is part of political freedom. 9. If your employees are in a union, seek the cooperation of union officials in conducting a study course on communism for your personnel. If no union is involved, ask your employees whether they would like such a course. The American Security Council can provide a complete program with speakers, films, tapes, and literature. Many other organizations are also available to help. 10. Get your local Chamber of Commerce behind regular freedom forums, which will help keep the entire community alert. 11. Be careful not to contribute to an organization until you know it is a bona fide patriotic group. Unknowingly, some businessmen have been financing cited Communist Front organizations. If you are a member of the American Security Council, you can check on any organization or any individual through their files. 12. Constantly keep in mind that American business is a major target for communist propaganda. Be alert to any activities which could feed ammunition to the enemy. 13. Furnish views and suggestions to your state and federal legislators. A letter to a congressman has more impact than many people realize. Suggestions for legislators. 1. The war between freedom and slavery can be lost in the legislative halls of free men. The wave of socialism, which is sweeping many free Western nations toward a kind of suppressive feudalism, is gaining ground. In this battle, our legislators are on the first line of defense. 2. The entire fabric of American security has been badly weakened by technical decisions of the Supreme Court in recent years. The only remedy is legislative action to restore these security laws. 3. Federal legislators should continue to support the congressional committees which are under attack by the Communist Party and their fellow travelers. This attack is a top priority project of the Communist Party at the present time. 4. Restore to congressional committees the right to determine whether the questions asked of pro-communist witnesses are pertinent. 5. Restore to congressional committees the same freedom to investigate communists and pro-communists that these committees have always had when investigating business and labor problems. 6. Restore to the states the right to enforce their own anti-subversive laws. 7. Restore to the Smith Act the provision which makes it a crime to teach or advocate the violent overthrow of the government. 8. Restore to the Smith Act the meaning of organize, which includes organizational work done after 1945 so that communist agents cannot hide behind the statute of limitations. 9. Restore to the executive branch of the government the right to determine reasonable grounds and to dismiss security risks in both sensitive and non-sensitive positions of the government. 10. Restore to the states the right to exclude from public employment and education those who refuse to testify about their communist activities and associates. 11. Restore to the executive branch the right to question aliens awaiting deportation about subversive associates and contacts, and the right to deport aliens who are found to be communists after entering the United States. 12. Restore to the executive branch the right to deny passports to those who refuse to sign a non-communist affidavit. 13. Restore to the states the right to exclude from the practice of law those who have been members of the communist conspiracy or who refuse to testify about communist activities. 14. Be alert to any attempt by left-wing forces to dismantle or emasculate the FBI. 15. Put into force the excellent recommendations of the Commission on Government Security, which were published in June 1957 but have never been acted upon. 16. Become familiar with the advantages of using powerful peacetime pressures against the USSR, especially in the economic and political fields. Suggestions for the press. 1. Keep in mind that the constant effort of the communist apparatus to plant its agents in all mass communications media. 2. Familiarize yourself with the current communist line which appears earlier in this chapter. Watch for individuals who shift with that line, often contradicting themselves to accommodate the latest zig or zag of party strategy. 3. In fulfilling the task of exposing crime, corruption, and inefficiency in the American culture, be careful not to destroy confidence in American institutions. Because the negative forces in our society are more likely to be news than the positive accomplishments, it is easy to overemphasize the negative side and provide extremely damaging propaganda to the enemy. 4. Run features on current issues which reflect a solid American interpretation of the problem. The communist avalanche of literature is often compounded by a left-wing slant to the news on a syndicated wire, which leaves the American point of view practically unexpressed. More and more newspaper editors are recognizing this problem and are doing something about it. 5. Use quotations from American patriots for box stories and fillers. 6. Develop a program of liaison with public officials so they will have an assurance of your ability to keep a confidence. It is desirable to have the press briefed on developments even though they may be confidential. Most officials start out with a desire to cooperate closely with the press, but they become secretive when distortions and premature releases weaken or destroy their capacity to get their job done properly. 7. Some members of the press have the knack of detecting communist influences in public life and have made excellent contributions by pointing these out. Temporarily, this action may not be popular, but it gives a newsman stature as events sustain his analysis. We need more analysts who are informed and sensitive to the techniques of the communist apparatus. Suggestions for ministers. 1. The churches became a major target for communist socialist infiltration many years ago. These people were successful in capturing many key positions in a number of important religious organizations. Some religious leaders openly advocate and defend communist principles. They are apologists for the Soviet Union and even advocate capitulation under threat of atomic war. 2. Study Judaism, Christianity, and communism to a point where you can quickly detect the fallacies which some persons in high places disseminate from their pulpits. 3. Develop a Bible-reading congregation. 4. Make religion a practical, dynamic force in the lives of the people. 5. Resist the erosion of the modernists who seek to discredit the Bible and to define God as an imaginary non-reality. As we pointed out in the first chapter of this book, many of those who started out a century ago to attack the Bible and to destroy our religious culture were close associates of Karl Marx. 6. Be alert to detect those who use social Christianity to cover up the fact that they are not Christians at all. 7. Watch for those who would use the principles of peace, brotherhood, tolerance, and Christian charity to obscure the conspiratorial aspects of communist peace. The peace of communism partakes of the prison and the grave. Remind professional pacifists who have accepted the paralyzing peace propaganda of the communists that the same Jesus who taught, "Love thy enemy," never advocated surrendering to him. The same Jesus who said, "Turn the other cheek" to avoid quarreling and bickering in the ordinary course of life, also said to take a sword to preserve life. Luke 22:36. The Jesus of Nazareth who cleansed the temple was demonstrating that right deserves to be defended. 8. If you come across those who labor under the misconception that communism and Christianity have a common denominator, ask them to read the chapter in this book entitled, "Did the Early Christians Practice Communism?" 9. Because of the counseling which ministers do, there are strenuous efforts to make inroads into the ministry. Be alert to the drive by certain analytical psychiatrists to have ministers accept their amoral philosophy. They opine that feelings of guilt and a sense of right and wrong cause mental illnesses. This entire concept is being discredited. There is far more mental health in the Judaic-Christian concept of resisting temptation and overcoming mistakes than ever emanated from the Freudian couch. I have prepared a rather comprehensive article on this subject entitled "Law Enforcement Looks at Mental Health," which appears in the professional police magazine Law and Order for March 1961. 10. In counseling students who are having difficulty reconciling the many conflicting views which they hear in school, you might refer them to the last chapter in this book, which is designed to help the student recognize the ideological conflict now in progress. It is hoped that this material will help them find their way through the confusion of many voices so as to maintain both moral and intellectual integrity. 11. Be careful to read books before you recommend them. Recently, some church groups have been induced to recommend books which turned out to be filled with obscenity. This is an important part of the socialist-communist campaign to discredit religious culture. What technique could better serve their purpose than to have the churches themselves sponsor degenerate literature? 12. Set up study groups on both youth and adult levels to study communism. Have qualified and well-informed persons serve as discussion leaders. The West can win. With every citizen watching for an opportunity to strike a blow for freedom, the force of communism can be halted, smothered, and then eliminated. This is our task. Without our tolerance and help, the communist empire would never have become the second strongest power in the earth. Now we have the job of dismantling it. Nikita Khrushchev knows the pressures we could bring pouring down upon him if our people ever make up their minds to move. Any who may lack the courage for positive action might well recall the thread of Manuelsky, which we have already quoted. He described communist strategy for the period we are now passing through. We shall begin by launching the most spectacular peace movement on record. The capitalist countries, stupid and decadent, will rejoice to cooperate in their own destruction. They will leap at another chance to be friends. As soon as their guard is down, we shall smash them with our clenched fist. Today, communism is advancing on all fronts. Authorities say that if we let her feed on the West just a few more years, it may be too late. How much better to send forth the message: there is a way to stop communism and do it without a major war. If free men are willing to study the problem and move across the world in one vast united front, it is entirely possible for the human race to celebrate the close of the 20th century with this monumental achievement. Freedom in our time for all men. End of Chapter 12, Part 2. End of the Naked Communist by W. Cleon Skousen.